The universe operates on principles we understand: physics, chemistry, the fundamental laws of cause and effect. Subspace follows predictable patterns. Wormholes open and close according to measurable quantum signatures. Even the prophets, those timeless entities dwelling in the celestial temple, operate within a framework Starfleet's scientists have mapped and studied for years. But what happens when something defies not just our sensors, but the very fabric of what we believe possible? What happens when an entire war fleet's numbering in the hundreds, carrying the grudges of a century and a half, tears through reality itself and arrives on our doorstep? Deep Space Nine hung in the darkness like a monument to resilience, its docking pylons extending toward the mouth of the Bajoran wormhole. The station had survived the Dominion War, barely, and now served as both a symbol of Federation resolve and a reminder of how close they'd come to annihilation. Commander Benjamin Sisko stood in ops, reviewing casualty reports from the final Dominion engagements near Cardassia Prime, when Lieutenant Commander Jadzia Dax's console erupted in urgent chirps. "Benjamin, I'm reading a massive subspace distortion forming 300,000 kilometers off the station's port side." Her fingers danced across the controls, spots furrowing with concentration. "These readings don't match anything in our database, not a wormhole, not a spatial anomaly, not even close to the Prophet's signature." Chief O'Brien was already routing emergency power to the shields. "Whatever it is, it's big. Really big." "Who?" The view screen flickered as the main display shifted to external sensors. At first, it looked like a tear in space itself, a jagged wound bleeding crimson and violet energy. Then the breach stabilized, and what emerged made everyone in ops fall silent. Ships. Dozens of them. Capital vessels, each massing several million tons, their hulls painted in stark blacks and grays, bristling with weapon batteries that could flatten a moon. They poured through the rupture information, organized into battle groups with the precision of a military force that had perfected warfare over generations. Behind the first wave came more cruisers, destroyers, carriers launching small fighter craft that swarmed like angry insects. But what froze Sisko's blood wasn't just the fleet emerging from impossible space. It was the fact that they were firing at each other. Bright lances of particle beam fire crossed the void between two distinct formations. One group bore sleek, predatory designs with golden Imperial crests emblazoned on their hulls. The other faction's ships were more utilitarian, marked with 13 stars arranged in a democratic constellation. Explosions blossomed in the darkness as armor plating vaporized under sustained bombardment. A destroyer on the democratic side took 3 direct hits to its port quarter and began tumbling, atmosphere venting from multiple hull breaches. "Shields up. Red alert." Sisko's command cut through the shock. "Hail them on all frequencies. All of them." "Benjamin, I'm reading over 60 capital ships and counting," Dax reported, her voice tight with controlled alarm. "Combined crew complements could exceed 1 million people. Their weapons are conventional particle beams and nuclear missiles, but the tonnage they're throwing around." Another massive ship emerged, dwarfing everything else. It had to be 15 kilometers long. A mobile fortress studded with hundreds of gun turrets. The golden Imperial crest on its bow identified it as a flagship. The vessel's main batteries swiveled with terrible purpose, targeting a cluster of democratic cruisers. "They're not responding to hails," Kira Nerys called from tactical. "I don't think they even know we're here. They're completely focused on killing each other." O'Brien's sensors chimed urgently. "Commander, that flagship is charging something big. Energy signature is spiking across the entire forward section." The Imperial flagship fired. A coherent beam of such intensity that it registered white on the view screen carved through space and struck a democratic battleship amidships. The target's armor held for exactly 2 seconds before catastrophic failure. The ship broke apart in a silent flower of fusion fire. Reactor cores breaching in sequence. Sisko watched hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives snuff out in an instant. These weren't the Borg, they weren't the Dominion. They were humans, or appeared to be, slaughtering each other with industrial efficiency while a subspace rupture pulsed behind them like an open wound in reality. "Get me Starfleet Command," Sisko ordered. "And someone find out where the hell they came from and why they brought their war to my doorstep." On the view screen, the battle intensified. More ships emerged from the rupture. The democratic forces were regrouping, launching fighter squadrons that swarmed the Imperial cruisers in coordinated attack patterns. The Imperials responded with devastating point defense fire, swatting fighters from space like insects. But the democratic pilots kept coming, suicidal in their determination. Dax's console erupted again. "Benjamin, the rupture is destabilizing. It's collapsing." The crimson tear in space convulsed, its edges folding inward. Ships still transiting the breach scrambled to clear the event horizon. One Imperial destroyer wasn't fast enough. The rupture closed on it like a vice, shearing the vessel in half. The aft section tumbled into normal space, trailing debris and bodies. The forward section simply ceased to exist. Then the rupture sealed completely, leaving only the fading subspace echo of its passage. 63 warships hung in space near Deep Space Nine, their battle grinding to a confused halt as both sides realized they were no longer in their own galaxy. Sensor arrays swept the unfamiliar stars. Crews ran diagnostics, trying to understand what had happened. Two fleets, locked in a war older than the Federation itself, suddenly stranded in a universe they didn't recognize. And they were all staring at the station. "Commander, we're being scanned," Kira reported. "Both factions. Active targeting sensors across the board." Sisko straightened in his chair, feeling the weight of first contact settling on his shoulders. But this wasn't first contact with a curious alien species or even a hostile one. This was first contact with two human civilizations that had just demonstrated their willingness to annihilate each other without hesitation. "Open a channel. All frequencies. All ships. If they won't answer, they'll at least hear us." Sisko waited for Kira's nod. "This is Commander Benjamin Sisko of Deep Space Nine, representing the United Federation of Planets. You have entered Federation space. Power down your weapons and prepare to receive diplomatic envoys. We mean you no harm, but we will defend ourselves if necessary." Silence answered him. On the view screen, the two fleets hung in space, weapons still hot, their ancient hatred temporarily overshadowed by the mystery of where they'd arrived and what they were going to do about it. If you want to see more characters enter the Star Trek universe, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you'd want to see in the comments below. Live long and prosper. The Democratic flagship's communication array finally flickered to life. A transmission request, encoded in a format Dax's systems barely recognized as compatible with Federation protocols. Someone over there was trying to talk. Sisko gestured. "Put it through." The view screen shifted to show a man in his early 30s, wearing a plain green military uniform with minimal decoration. He had dark hair, tired eyes, and the bearing of someone who'd seen too much war and survived it through intelligence rather than aggression. Behind him, officers worked frantically at consoles that looked decades behind Federation technology. "This is Admiral Yang Wen-li of the Free Planets Alliance." His voice was calm, almost conversational, as if he hadn't just fought a battle that claimed thousands of lives. "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. I assure you, it wasn't intentional. We seem to have experienced a rather significant navigational error." Sisko studied the man on the view screen with the careful attention he'd learned from years of negotiating with Cardassians, appeasing Klingons, and navigating Romulan doublespeak. Admiral Yang Wen-li didn't look like a conqueror. He looked exhausted. The kind of exhaustion that came from fighting a war you didn't believe in but couldn't afford to lose. "A navigational error," Sisko repeated, gesturing toward the debris field still glowing on the auxiliary displays. "Admiral, your navigational error just brought 63 warships into Federation space while engaged in active combat. I count at least 4 destroyed vessels and thousands of casualties. I need more than an apology." Yang's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Respect, perhaps. For someone who wouldn't accept diplomatic platitudes. "You're right, of course. The truth is we don't know what happened. We were engaged with Galactic Empire forces near the Azurlone corridor when a subspace phenomenon, your terminology, I'm guessing from context, tore open in the middle of the battlefield. Both fleets were caught in the gravitational pull. Now we're here. Wherever here is. Here is the Bajoran system, Alpha Quadrant. Federation space." Dax interjected from her console. "You're approximately 65,000 light-years from the galactic core. Assuming you originated somewhere in our galaxy at all." Yang turned to someone off-screen, conversing rapidly in a language the universal translator struggled to parse before settling on standard. He looked back at Sisko, and for the first time, genuine concern crossed his features. "Commander Sisko, my navigators are telling me that the stellar cartography doesn't match anything in our databases. The constellations are wrong. All of them. Either we've been displaced an impossible distance, or..." He trailed off, the implication hanging heavy. "Or you're not in your galaxy anymore," Sisko finished. "We've dealt with interuniversal displacement before, Admiral. It's rare, but not impossible. The question now is what you intend to do about it." Before Yang could respond, a second transmission request chimed across Kira's console. She glanced at Sisko with raised eyebrows. "The Imperial flagship is hailing us. Looks like they want to join the conversation." "Split screen," Sisko ordered. The view screen divided. On the left, Admiral Yang Wen-li maintained his tired composure. On the right, a young man appeared who couldn't have been more than 25, but carried himself with the absolute authority of someone born to rule. He had striking blonde hair, ice blue eyes, and wore an immaculate white and gold uniform that practically screamed aristocracy, where Yang looked like he'd been ground down by war. This man looked like he'd been forged by it into something sharp and deadly. I am Reinhard von Lohengramm, Imperial Marshal of the Galactic Empire and Supreme Commander of the Space Armada. His voice cut through the channel with crystalline precision. I don't know what political entity you represent, Commander Sisko, but I suggest you consider your next words carefully. My fleet has just been displaced by forces unknown, and I'm not in a charitable mood. Sisko felt Kira tense and tactical. O'Brien's fingers hovered over the weapons authorization console, but Sisko kept his voice level, projecting the kind of calm authority that had talked the Dominion into temporary ceasefires and convinced skeptical Bajorans to trust the Federation. Marshal von Lohengramm, threats are unnecessary. You're not prisoners, but you're also not conquerors. You've arrived in a sovereign system. And whether you like it or not, you're subject to our laws while you're here. Reinhard's eyes narrowed. Laws? How quaint. Tell me, Commander, how many ships does your Federation have in this system? How many can you mobilize within the hour? Enough, Sisko replied, though they both knew it was a bluff. Deep Space Nine had barely recovered from the Dominion War. The nearest Starfleet reinforcements were days away. But let's not pretend this is about military strength. You're stranded in unknown space, cut off from whatever supply lines and reinforcements you relied on. Both of you. He looked between the two admirals. You can keep fighting each other and guarantee mutual destruction, or you can accept our assistance in understanding what happened and finding a way home. Yang's expression shifted towards something resembling approval. Reinhard's remained unreadable, calculating. The silence stretched for 3 long seconds. My sensors indicate your station is armed but not heavily, Reinhard said finally. Your energy signatures suggest advanced shielding technology and weapons I don't recognize. You're confident, Commander. But you're also smart enough to know that 63 capital ships could reduce your station to atoms before your reinforcements arrive. They could try, Kira interjected, her Bajoran accent sharp with defiance. But we survived the Dominion. We'll survive you too. Reinhard's lips quirked into something that might have been a smile. I like her. She has spirit. He leaned forward slightly. Very well, Commander Sisko. I'll accept a temporary cessation of hostilities with the Alliance forces only while we assess our situation. But understand this. The Galactic Empire doesn't negotiate from weakness. We are not refugees begging for your charity. Neither are we, Yang added quietly. Though I suspect Marshal von Lohengramm and I would define charity very differently. He met Reinhard's gaze across the split screen, and the tension between them was palpable even through subspace communication. Commander Sisko, the Free Planets Alliance will comply with your request for diplomatic talks. But I need guarantees that Imperial forces won't use this ceasefire to position for a first strike. Paranoid as always. Yang Wen-li, Reinhard said. Though I suppose that's kept you alive this long. Gentlemen, Sisko interrupted before the exchange could escalate. Here's what's going to happen. Both of you will pull your fleets back to a neutral distance from this station, say, 500,000 kilometers. You'll maintain current positions relative to each other to prevent either side from gaining tactical advantage. Then you'll each send a single shuttle with no more than 5 representatives to Deep Space Nine for face-to-face negotiations. No weapons, no tricks. We'll discuss what happened, what we know, and what options exist for getting you home. Yang nodded immediately. Acceptable. Reinhard considered for a moment longer. Agreed. But if this is a trap, Commander, you'll discover that the Empire's retaliation is swift and absolute. Noted, Sisko replied dryly. Deep Space Nine out. Both transmissions cut. The view screen returned to the tactical display showing the 2 massive fleets hanging in space like apex predators circling each other, neither willing to show weakness by moving first. Dax rotated her chair to face Sisko. Well, that was fun. We just volunteered to mediate between 2 human civilizations that have apparently been trying to exterminate each other for over a century. Any idea how we're going to pull that off? Not yet, Sisko admitted. He moved to the tactical station, studying the ship formations with O'Brien. Chief, what's your assessment of their technology? O'Brien pulled up comparative scans, highlighting weapon signatures and propulsion systems. Interesting stuff. Commander, their ships are massive dwarfs anything we've got except maybe a Galaxy-class starship. But the technology is oddly primitive in some ways and sophisticated in others. No shields as we know them. They rely on heavy armor plating. Their particle beams are powerful but conventional. No phasers. No photon torpedoes. Their propulsion looks like a variation on impulse drive with some kind of compressed fusion reaction. But I'm not reading any warp signatures. They don't have warp capability? Kira asked. Surprised. Doesn't look like it. Which means whatever brought them here moved them an unimaginable distance instantaneously. O'Brien highlighted the subspace residue still lingering where the rupture had closed. I'm reading exotic particles in that debris field, tachyons. Chronometric radiation. Dimensional variance signatures. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. Something caused it. Sisko absorbed that information, his mind already racing through the implications. Two massive military powers, displaced from their home galaxy, stranded without faster-than-light travel, locked in a war they couldn't abandon even when faced with the unknown, and somehow, Deep Space Nine had just become the negotiating table where their fate would be decided. Jadzia, start analyzing that subspace residue. I want to know everything about what brought them here and whether it's likely to happen again. Kira, coordinate with Odo. I want security protocols in place before those shuttles dock. If these talks go wrong, I don't want armed soldiers from two warring factions loose on the promenade. Already on it. Kira confirmed. Sisko turned toward his office, then paused. On the view screen, the fleets were finally moving slowly, cautiously, pulling back to the agreed-upon distance. Two forces that had perfected the art of killing each other, now forced to share the same unfamiliar sky. One more thing, Sisko said. Get me everything you can find on historical Earth conflicts. I want to understand what drives people to fight a war for 150 years. Because if we're going to convince them to stop, we need to understand what they're really fighting for. Dax's expression turned somber. You think we can stop them? Sisko watched the fleet settle into their uneasy positions, weapons still charged, targeting solutions still active, waiting for the slightest excuse to resume hostilities. I don't know. But if we don't try, that war just became our problem too. The conference room on Deep Space Nine's habitat ring had hosted countless negotiations, Bajoran provisional government meetings, Cardassian reparation talks, even that disastrous first encounter with Dominion representatives. But Sisko had never felt tension quite like this. Two shuttles sat in Docking Bay 5 under heavy security, their crews confined to their vessels while their respective admirals and advisors were escorted through the station's corridors under Odo's watchful eye. Sisko stood at the head of the conference table, Kira and Dax flanking him. Through the viewport behind them, both alien fleets hung in the darkness like storm clouds waiting to break. The door slid open, and Odo entered first, his shapeshifter's eyes scanning the room with habitual suspicion. The delegations. Commander, Odo announced formally. Admiral Yang Wen-li entered first, accompanied by 4 officers. Yang himself wore the same plain green uniform from the transmission, but his companions represented a cross-section of military professionalism: a grizzled older man with the bearing of a career soldier, a sharp-eyed woman wearing intelligence insignia, a younger officer carrying data tablets, and a middle-aged man whose civilian clothes marked him as a political attaché. They moved with the careful discipline of people accustomed to being in enemy territory. Reinhard von Lohengramm followed moments later, and the contrast was striking. His white and gold uniform seemed to absorb light, and his 4 companions were equally immaculate. A tall, older man with red hair and a scarred face stood at Reinhard's right, clearly a military advisor of significant rank. The others included a stern woman with calculating eyes, a younger blonde officer who shared Reinhard's aristocratic features, and a man whose civilian dress suggested political authority. They entered like conquerors inspecting newly acquired territory. Please. Sit. Sisko gestured to the chairs arranged on opposite sides of the table. The symbolic division wasn't lost on anyone. Yang took his seat with minimal ceremony, his officers following suit. Reinhard remained standing for a moment longer, making a point of surveying the room before settling into his chair with practiced grace. The unspoken hierarchy established, Sisko retook his own seat. Thank you both for agreeing to this meeting. I'm Commander Benjamin Sisko of Deep Space Nine and the United Federation of Planets. This is Major Kira Neres, my first officer, and Lieutenant Commander Jadzia Dax, our Chief Science Officer. Before we begin substantive discussions, I think we all need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. Admiral Yang, you mentioned the Iserlohn corridor. Admiral Reinhard, you command the Galactic Empire. I'd like to understand what brought you both here and what you were fighting over. The red-haired man beside Reinhard leaned forward. With respect, Commander, the Empire's strategic objectives are not. Reinhard raised a hand, silencing his advisor. No. Senior Admiral von Ruental. If we're going to be stranded in this place, we need these people's cooperation, whether I like it or not. He met Sisko's gaze directly. Very well, a history lesson, then. The Galactic Empire and the Free Planets Alliance have been at war for 150 years. The Empire controls the central regions of our galaxy under the rule of the Golden Bomb dynasty. The Alliance rebelled, established a democratic government on the periphery, and we've been locked in conflict ever since. 150 years. Dax breathed. That's 5 generations of constant warfare. 6, actually, Yang corrected quietly. I'm the 6th generation of my family to serve in this war. My grandfather fought at the Battle of Dagon. My father died at Astarte. I've been fighting since I was drafted at 22, and I'm 33 now. This is all any of us have ever known. Kira's expression softened almost imperceptibly. She understood generational conflict better than most. What started it? The intelligence officer beside Yang, the sharp-eyed woman, spoke up. The Golden Bomb dynasty is an autocratic regime that seized power 6 centuries ago. Rudolf von Goldenbaum declared himself emperor and imposed a rigid caste system, inferior gene exclusion laws, suppression of democratic ideals, execution of dissidents. 2.5 million people fled to the frontier and established the Free Planets Alliance as a beacon of democracy and human rights. A romantic narrative. The stern woman beside Reinhard interjected coldly. The beacon of democracy has become as corrupt and self-serving as any government. Politicians who've never seen a battlefield sending conscripts to die for re-election campaigns. At least the Empire is honest about its hierarchy. Honest tyranny is still tyranny, Baroness Westphale, Yang replied without heat, though I won't pretend the alliance is perfect. Wars this long don't have heroes anymore, just survivors and corpses. Sisko watched the exchange carefully. These weren't fanatics or ideologues. They were exhausted soldiers who'd inherited a conflict neither had started and couldn't seem to end. Let me understand this correctly. You've been fighting for 150 years over. What? Territory? Resources? Ideology? All of the above. Yang admitted. But mostly because neither side can afford to lose. The Empire sees the Alliance as a rebellious province that must be brought to heel. The Alliance sees the Empire as an existential threat to human freedom. Every generation, the reasons matter less and the momentum matters more. We fight because we've always fought, because stopping means admitting all those deaths were for nothing. Reinhard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Speak for yourself, Yang Wen-li. The Empire fights because order and unity are the only paths to human prosperity. Democracy is chaos dressed in noble rhetoric, mob rule where the mediocre vote themselves power and squander it on self-interest. History proves that humanity needs guidance from those qualified to lead. History also proves that absolute power corrupts absolutely, Dax countered. The Federation was founded on principles of self-determination and cooperation between equals. We've had our share of conflicts, but we've also achieved a level of peace and prosperity that seems to be eluding both of you. How many planets does your Federation control? Reinhard asked. Over 150 member worlds, Sisko answered. Voluntarily joined, each maintaining their own cultural identity and local governance while contributing to collective defense and scientific advancement. Reinhard's expression suggested skepticism but also calculation. And your military strength? Substantial. Sisko replied carefully. We recently concluded a devastating war with the Dominion of Force from the Gamma Quadrant that nearly destroyed the Alpha Quadrant's major powers. We survived, but at tremendous cost. Thousands of ships lost, billions of casualties across multiple species. Yang's eyes sharpened with professional interest. You said multiple species. Your personnel files mention different races. You're not all human? Major Kira is Bajoran. Sisko gestured. Commander Dax is a trilosymbiotic species, where a long-lived symbiont joins with a humanoid host. My chief of security, Odo, is a changeling, a shapeshifter. The Federation includes Vulcans, Andorians, Tellarites, and dozens of other species, all working together. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Yang's officers exchanged glances of genuine surprise. Reinhard's delegation looked skeptical, though the young blonde officer beside him clearly related. Perhaps a sibling leaned forward with undisguised curiosity. Aliens, the young officer said. Actual alien species. Sister, we always theorized they must exist somewhere in the universe, but to encounter them like this. Maintain composure. Anna rose. Reinhard said quietly, though his own facade had cracked slightly. He studied Kira with new attention. You're not human. Yet you hold significant authority in their military structure. I'm not in Starfleet, Kira corrected. I'm Bajoran militia, assigned to this station as part of a joint operation. But yes, I hold the rank of Major and Commander Sisko's trust, regardless of my species. The scarred Admiral von Ruenthal spoke again, his tone less confrontational now. This changes the strategic landscape considerably, Marshal. If this Federation has successfully integrated multiple alien species under a unified government, their technological and military capabilities may exceed our initial assessments. Indeed, Reinhard acknowledged. He turned back to Sisko, which brings us to the relevant question. Commander, you've been hospitable, but you're also evaluating us as potential threats or assets. So let me be direct. What do you want from us? Sisko appreciated the candor. Right now? I want to understand if you're going to keep fighting each other in our space, because if you are, we have a problem. The Federation doesn't tolerate military conflicts in our territory, especially ones that could threaten civilian populations or disrupt shipping lanes. You'd enforce a ceasefire? Yang asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. If necessary, Sisko confirmed. We'd prefer cooperation. But we will defend our interests. Reinhard laughed a short, sharp sound without humor. You have one station and maybe a dozen ships within response range. Commander Sisko, I respect your confidence. But let's not pretend you have the military strength to enforce anything on 2 fleets totaling 63 capital ships. Maybe not directly, Dax interjected. But we do have something you need. Information. You're stranded in unknown space with no navigation data, no supply lines, and no way home. We have the technology and knowledge to help you understand what happened and potentially find a solution. But that requires trust. And trust requires peace. The room fell silent. Through the viewport, the fleets continued their patient watch, weapons charged, waiting for orders that would determine whether this encounter ended in cooperation or catastrophe. Yang broke the silence first. A practical argument. Very well. Commander Sisko. The Free Planets Alliance will maintain ceasefire protocols with Federation forces. As for the Empire, he looked at Reinhard with the weary familiarity of old enemies. I propose a mutual non-aggression pact while we're in this system. Neither side initiates hostilities without clear provocation. We focus on understanding our situation before resuming our war. Reinhard's fingers drummed once on the table, a brief tell of internal debate. The Empire accepts those terms, with one condition: any intelligence gathered about our displacement is shared equally between all parties. If there's a way home, neither side gets exclusive access. Agreed, Yang said immediately. Sisko nodded. The Federation will act as neutral mediator and share all findings. But I'm adding a condition of my own. While you're in Federation space, you're subject to Federation law. That means no attacks on civilian vessels, no territorial aggression, and no war crimes. Break those rules, and you'll answer to Starfleet. Reinhard's expression hardened, but before he could respond, Yang spoke up. Your war crimes prohibition define it. Our rules of engagement may differ from yours. Lach. Kira's voice carried the weight of personal experience. No targeting of civilians. No orbital bombardment of inhabited planets. No genocide. No torture or execution of prisoners. Basic standards of sentient rights. Yang nodded slowly. The Alliance can accept those terms. We've maintained similar protocols. Though I won't pretend every commander has followed them perfectly. All eyes turned to Reinhard. The young Imperial Marshal sat motionless for a long moment, his ice blue eyes calculating odds and outcomes that only he could see. Finally, he inclined his head fractionally. The Empire will comply. For now. It wasn't trust. It wasn't even genuine cooperation. But it was a start. The initial conference had established a fragile framework: ceasefire, information sharing, mutual non-aggression, but Sisko knew that agreements made in conference rooms often collapsed under the weight of reality. The real test would come in the days that followed, when exhausted crews and trigger-happy commanders had to translate diplomatic promises into operational restraint. Dax's science teams worked around the clock analyzing the subspace rupture's residue, while both the Imperial and Alliance fleets maintained their wary positions. Sisko had authorized limited resupply assistance, medical provisions, replacement parts that weren't strategically sensitive, and most importantly, updated star charts that showed just how far from home they truly were. Yang Wen-li had taken the news with characteristic philosophical resignation. Reinhard von Lohengramm had stared at the galactic map for a full minute before dismissing his staff and requesting privacy. Even conquerors, it seemed, could be humbled by the infinite. 3 days after the initial contact, Sisko found himself in one of Deep Space Nine's smaller conference rooms with Yang, discussing something the Alliance Admiral had specifically requested. The Prime Directive. Let me see if I understand correctly, Yang said, nursing a cup of Roctagino that he'd taken to with surprising enthusiasm. Your Federation encounters pre-warp civilizations, societies that haven't developed faster than light travel, and you simply observe them? No contact? No intervention? No matter what you witness? That's the essence of it, Sisko confirmed. We believe that every civilization has the right to develop naturally, without outside interference. Contact before they're ready can be catastrophic cultural contamination, dependency, even civilizational collapse. Yang's expression was difficult to read. And if you observe genocide? Planetary catastrophe? A society destroying itself through war or disease? We watch. Sisko said quietly. And it's one of the hardest things Starfleet officers ever have to do. There are exceptions. The directive has been violated when the alternative was extinction or when contamination had already occurred. But the general principle stands. We don't play God. How remarkably restrained, Yang murmured. The Alliance would never accept such a policy. We're too desperate for resources, allies, strategic positions. Every habitable world is a potential base. Every population a source of recruits or labor. He paused, studying Sisko. You're horrified by that? Aren't you? I'm concerned. Sisko chose his words carefully. The Federation doesn't claim moral superiority, Admiral. We've made mistakes, violated our own principles when we were desperate or afraid. But we try to hold ourselves to a standard that prioritizes autonomy and dignity for all sentient life. All sentient life. Yang repeated the phrase like he was tasting something foreign. In our galaxy, Commander, all sentient life means humans. Just humans. 40 billion of them in the Empire, 25 billion in the Alliance, scattered across hundreds of star systems. We've never encountered another intelligent species. Never even found convincing evidence that they exist. When you showed me that your Major Kira is an entirely different species from Earth, it fundamentally changed my understanding of the universe. Sisko leaned forward. How so? Because it means the war is even more pointless than I thought. Yang's smile was bitter. We've been fighting over who gets to rule humanity for 150 years. Democracy versus autocracy, freedom versus order. The great ideological struggle that defines our entire civilization. And now I discover there's a galaxy out here where dozens of species manage to coexist peacefully under a framework that respects both individual liberty and collective security. It makes our conflict look provincial, small. That's not necessarily true. Sisko argued. The questions you're fighting over: how to govern, how to balance freedom with stability, what rights citizens have versus the state, those are fundamental questions every civilization faces. The Federation found one answer. It's not the only answer. Yang's eyes sharpened. You're being generous, Commander. But we both know that my government is corrupt, inefficient, and sends conscripts to die for political theater. And Reinhard's empire is built on aristocratic privilege and genetic purity laws that would make your Federation physically ill. Neither of us represents the ideal we claim to fight for anymore. We're just momentum, inertia dressed up in patriotic speeches and strategic necessity. Before Sisko could respond, his combadge chirped. Commander, this is Ops. We've got a situation developing. Sisko tapped the badge. Go ahead, Major. Kira's voice carried tension. 2 ships have broken formation, 1 Imperial destroyer and 1 Alliance cruiser. They're on an intercept course with each other, weapons hot. They're not responding to hails from their own flagships or from us. That's. Yang was already on his feet. His earlier contemplation vanishing behind professional urgency. Which ships? Alliance vessel identifies as the Patroclus. Captain Merkat's commanding. Imperial vessel is the Schwarzschild. Captain Steinhoff. Yang's jaw tightened. Merkat's lost his son at the Battle of Amritsar 3 months ago. Killed by Imperial bombers targeting his flagship's bridge. If he's decided to settle personal scores. They were moving before he finished the sentence. Sisko leading the way back to Ops at a run. The view screen showed the tactical situation in brutal clarity. 2 warships, each massing several million tons, closing at combat speeds. The destroyer was smaller but more maneuverable. The cruiser had superior firepower, but needed time to bring its main batteries to bear. Hail both vessels, Sisko ordered. All frequencies. No response, Kira reported. Their targeting systems are active. Estimate weapons range in 40 seconds. Dax's fingers flew across her console. Benjamin, I'm reading power spikes in both ships' main reactors. They're committed to engagement. Sisko made a decision. Chief, target both ships with tractor beams. Low power, I want to slow them down, not provoke them. Kira, charge phasers but hold fire unless they shoot at us. Tractor beams engaging, O'Brien confirmed. Got them both, they're fighting it, but we're definitely slowing their approach. On the split screen, 2 angry faces appeared. The Alliance captain was older, gray-haired, with eyes that had seen too much death and stopped caring about consequences. The Imperial captain was younger, aristocratic, sneering with contempt at the interference. Deep Space Nine, disengage immediately, Captain Merkatz growled. This is a military matter between Alliance and Imperial forces. Your interference violates. There is no military matter in Federation space without my authorization. Sisko cut him off. You're under tractor beam. Stand down your weapons or I'll disable both your ships. You don't have the authority to order me, Commander, the Imperial Captain Steinhoff snapped. The Empire answers to Marshal von Lohengramm, not to some backwater station commander playing peacekeeper. Yang's voice cut across the channel, cold and commanding. Captain Merkatz, this is Admiral Yang. Stand down immediately. That's a direct order. Merkatz's expression flickered with conflict. Sir, with respect, the Schwarzschild's captain has been identified in Imperial communications as responsible for the Amritsar attack. My son. I know. Yang said quietly. I know what you lost, Merkatz. But this isn't the place or time. We're stranded in unknown space under temporary truce. If you fire, you risk more than just your own crew. You risk everyone. On the Imperial channel, a new voice interrupted. Captain Steinhoff, you will power down your weapons immediately. Reinhard von Lohengramm's face appeared beside Steinhoff's, and the young captain went pale. That is not a request. Armistice. But Marshal. This Alliance dog insulted the Empire's honor by. I don't care if he insulted your mother and your ancestral bloodline. Reinhard's voice could have cut steel. We are operating under ceasefire protocols that I personally authorized. If you violate those protocols, you violate my direct command. Do I need to explain the consequences of that? Steinhoff's aristocratic sneer evaporated. No, Marshal. Powering down weapons. Merkatz held out longer, staring at Yang through the view screen with anguished defiance. Then, slowly, he gave the order. Helm. All stop. Weapons to standby. The tactical display showed both ships drifting to a halt, separated by less than 50,000 kilometers point-blank range in space combat. The tractor beams held them like a parent separating brawling children. Sisko exhaled tension he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Captain Merkatz, Captain Steinhoff, you will both return to your respective fleet formations immediately. If either of you breaks formation again without authorization, I will consider it an act of aggression and respond accordingly. Is that understood? Grudging acknowledgements came from both captains. The tractor beams released, and the ships began their slow retreat back to their fleets, like predators denied their prey. When the channel closed, Yang sank into the chair at the auxiliary tactical station, suddenly looking every one of his 33 years and then some. Thank you, Commander. That could have escalated catastrophically. It still might, Kira observed grimly. You've got crews on both sides who've been killing each other for decades. 3 days of ceasefire doesn't erase that kind of hatred. No, Yang agreed. It doesn't. Which is why I need to ask you something, Commander Sisko. He looked up, and his expression was haunted. If we can't go home if your scientists determine that the rupture was a one-time event and there's no way back, what happens to us? 63 capital ships. Over 1 million people total. All trained for nothing but war. What do we do in a galaxy that's already moved past the kind of conflict we represent? Sisko didn't have an easy answer. Through the view screen, he could see both fleets settling back into their formations. The brief flare of violence suppressed but not extinguished. Two civilizations built on generational warfare, suddenly forced to consider a future where their enemy wasn't going away and their home might be permanently out of reach. We find a way forward, Sisko said finally. Together, if possible. But that requires both sides to want peace more than they want victory. Victory. Yang laughed without humor. I stopped believing in victory a long time ago, Commander. Now I just believe in survival. The question is whether survival is enough to build a future on. The door to Ops opened and Odo entered. His expression grim even by his standards. Commander. We have another problem. My security teams just broke up a fight on the promenade between Alliance and Imperial officers who were on shore leave. 3 injured, 1 in critical condition. And I'm hearing reports that both fleet commanders are preparing to restrict all future shore leave and fortify their defensive positions. Yang pushed himself to his feet wearily. The spiral begins. Mistrust breeds restrictions. Restrictions breed resentment. Resentment breeds incidents. We've seen this pattern 1,000 times. Then we break the pattern, Sisko said firmly. Admiral, I want you and Marshal von Lohengramm to authorize joint operations small scale to start. Repair crews working together on damaged ships. Science teams collaborating on the subspace analysis. Cultural exchanges, anything that gets your people interacting as something other than enemies. You're asking them to betray 150 years of conditioning in a few weeks, Yang pointed out. That's optimistic even by your Federation standards. I'm asking them to try, Sisko corrected. Because the alternative is watching them tear each other apart in our space, and I won't allow that. Yang studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. I'll speak with Reinhard. He's pragmatic, if nothing else. He understands that mutual destruction serves no one's interests. As Yang left to coordinate with his flagship, Dax moved to stand beside Sisko. You know this could backfire spectacularly. Force them together too quickly and you might accelerate the conflict instead of dampening it. I know, Sisko admitted. But doing nothing guarantees failure. At least this way we're taking action. On the view screen, both fleets hung in the darkness, and Sisko couldn't shake the feeling that they were all standing on the edge of something that could either be a breakthrough or a catastrophe. The only question was which way they'd fall. The joint operations began cautiously, like two wild animals circling each other, testing for weakness while maintaining escape routes. Sisko had authorized the use of Deep Space Nine's upper docking pylons for repairs to damaged vessels from both fleets. 1. Imperial destroyer with radiation leaks in its engineering section. 1 Alliance cruiser with compromised structural integrity from the battle that had brought them here. Chief O'Brien supervised the operation with the enthusiasm of an engineer presented with fascinating new technology and the wariness of a veteran who'd learned not to trust enemy soldiers too quickly. The repair crews worked on opposite sides of the docking ring initially, but proximity and professional curiosity gradually drew them together. Commander, you need to see this. O'Brien's voice carried equal parts admiration and concern over the comm. Sisko found him in Docking Bay 7, standing between an Alliance engineering team and their Imperial counterparts. Both groups clustered around a dismantled reactor assembly from the Alliance cruiser, their initial hostility forgotten in the face of a shared technical challenge. This is incredible work, an Imperial engineer was saying. A young woman with lieutenant's insignia who seemed to have forgotten she was addressing the enemy. You're running a compressed fusion cycle with manual regulation? No computer oversight? An Alliance engineer, older and grizzled, grunted acknowledgement. Automation fails in combat. Gets hit by electromagnetic pulses, cosmic radiation, enemy jamming. Manual systems are slower but more reliable when you're 20 light-years from the nearest repair dock and someone's shooting at you. Inefficient but pragmatic, the Imperial officer conceded. Our systems are fully automated but require more maintenance infrastructure. Perhaps a hybrid approach. Excuse me, O'Brien interrupted. Are you two actually collaborating on reactor design improvements? Both engineers looked at him, then at each other, and then seemed to realize what they'd been doing. The moment of professional camaraderie fractured, old suspicions reasserting themselves. We were simply discussing technical specifications, the Imperial lieutenant said stiffly. No collaboration intended. The Alliance engineer nodded agreement. But Sisko noticed his eyes lingering on the reactor components with the look of someone seeing possibilities he hadn't considered before. Actually, Sisko interjected, I think collaboration is exactly what we need. Chief O'Brien, what if we formalize this? Create joint engineering workshops where both sides can share technical knowledge that doesn't compromise tactical security? O'Brien's expression suggested he thought Sisko might be insane, but he'd followed crazier orders. Aye, sir. I suppose we could set up a few sessions in engineering. Keep them focused on civilian applications, reactor efficiency, life support optimization, that sort of thing. The Imperial lieutenant's eyes lit up with barely concealed interest. The Alliance engineer tried to maintain his gruff exterior but failed completely. Within an hour, O'Brien had 6 engineers from each fleet crammed into a conference room arguing about plasma confinement ratios with the passion of academics debating philosophy. But not every interaction proved so productive. Odo's security reports painted a darker picture. The promenade had become a battleground of subtle hostilities, Imperial officers refusing to enter establishments where Alliance personnel gathered, Alliance crew members deliberately crowding out Imperial visitors from Quark's bar, escalating verbal confrontations that Odo's deputies had to defuse before they turned physical. It's tribal behavior, Odo reported during the senior staff meeting. Both groups are marking territory, establishing dominance hierarchies. They're not fighting yet, but they're preparing to fight. Testing boundaries. 1. Kira leaned back in her chair. During the Cardassian occupation of Bajor, we saw the same thing. Put occupiers and resistance fighters in the same space and even peace negotiations become battlefield tactics by other means. The question is whether we can interrupt the cycle before it becomes self-reinforcing. Yang and Reinhard are trying, Dax noted. Yang issued orders encouraging cultural exchange. Reinhard authorized limited trade between fleets for non-military supplies. But orders from above only work if the people below are willing to comply. Sisko considered the problem. Military discipline could enforce behavior, but it couldn't change hearts. These people had been raised from birth to see each other as existential threats. 3 weeks of proximity wasn't going to erase that conditioning. We need to give them a reason to see each other differently, Sisko said. Something that requires genuine cooperation and produces tangible benefits for both sides. Like what? Kira asked skeptically. A team-building exercise? Trust falls in zero gravity? Dax's console chimed before Sisko could respond. Her expression shifted from sardonic to intensely focused. Benjamin, I'm reading something strange. There's a subspace distortion forming not like the original rupture, but similar signature. It's small, unstable, and it's appearing approximately 2 million kilometers from the station. Everyone in the room went still. Could it be another displacement event? O'Brien asked, already pulling up the sensor data. Are we about to get more guests? I don't think so, Dax said slowly, her spots crinkling in concentration. The energy signature is too weak to transport matter. But it's definitely connected to the original phenomenon. If I had to guess, I'd say it's a residual effect like an echo of the rupture that brought them here. Sisko's mind raced. An echo? If we can study it, analyze the subspace mechanics, we might be able to understand how the original rupture formed and whether it's reproducible. Dax finished. Benjamin, this could be their way home. Or it could be nothing, Kira cautioned. How long will this distortion last? Dax checked her instruments. Hard to say. The energy signature is fluctuating. Could be minutes. Could be hours. But if we're going to study it effectively, we need to get sensor platforms close and we need to do it fast. Sisko made his decision. Contact both flagships. Tell them what we've found and that we need to deploy a joint science mission immediately. 1 ship from each fleet, equipped with the best sensors they have, working alongside the Defiant to analyze this phenomenon. You want to send Imperial and Alliance vessels on a joint mission? Odo said flatly. Commander, we can barely keep them from killing each other in the promenade. You're going to put them in combat-capable warships in close proximity to each other and hope they focus on science? Yes, Sisko said simply. Because if this is their chance to go home, they need to see that cooperation serves their interests better than conflict. And if it's not their way home, they need to understand that conclusively before hope turns to desperation. The meeting adjourned with a mixture of determination and dread. Kira went to prepare the Defiant for deployment. Dax began coordinating sensor protocols with both fleet's science divisions. O'Brien muttered something about optimistic commanders and impossible assignments while heading to engineering. Within 2 hours, 3 ships hung in space near the subspace distortion. The Defiant, an Imperial science vessel called the Percival, and an Alliance research ship named the Hippocrates. The distortion itself appeared on sensors as a twisted wound in space-time, approximately 2 kilometers across, pulsing with exotic energy patterns that made Dax's instruments sing with excitement. This is the Defiant to all vessels. Sisko transmitted from the captain's chair. We're going to coordinate sensor sweeps across multiple subspace bands. The Imperial vessel will focus on higher frequencies, the Alliance ship will cover lower bands, and will handle the middle spectrum. Share all data in real time. If this thing collapses, I want to make sure we've captured everything. Acknowledgements came from both ships, professional if not enthusiastic. The Percival's captain was a middle-aged woman with the careful diction of someone who'd been educated in Imperial military academies. The Hippocrates was commanded by a younger officer whose democratic manners couldn't quite hide his suspicion of Imperial cooperation. The sensor sweeps began. On the Defiant's main screen, Dax integrated the data streams from all 3 ships, and the picture that emerged was both fascinating and frustrating. The distortion is definitely artificial in origin, Dax reported. I'm reading residual tachyon particles, chronometric radiation, and something else dimensional variance that suggests this rupture connects to somewhere other than normal space. Can you determine where it leads? Sisko asked. Not with current data. But if we could stabilize the distortion, expand it, we might be able to. The distortion pulsed violently. Energy readings spiked across all 3 ships' sensors. And then something came through. It wasn't a ship. It was organic or had been once. The creature that emerged from the rift was massive, easily 100 meters long, with a body that seemed to exist partially in normal space and partially in some other dimension. Its surface rippled with colors that didn't exist in conventional physics. Multiple appendages, tentacles, wings, or something else entirely writhed around a central mass that defied coherent description. What in the prophet's name is that? Kira breathed from tactical. The creature screamed. The sound didn't transmit through vacuum but somehow bypassed conventional physics to resonate directly in their minds, a psychic shriek of hunger, confusion, and rage. All 3 ships' crews reeled from the telepathic assault. It's feeding on the subspace distortion. Dax managed through gritted teeth. The exotic energy. It's drawn to dimensional breaches the way a shark is drawn to blood in water. The creature's appendages lashed out, striking the edge of the distortion. The rupture flickered, destabilized further, and began expanding. On sensors, the energy signature went chaotic. All ships, evasive maneuvers, Sisko ordered. Do not fire unless it attacks directly. We don't know what. The Percival's captain made a different decision. All batteries. Open fire. Eliminate the threat. Particle beams lanced out from the Imperial science vessel, converging on the creature's central mass. The beams passed through sections of the creature's body without effect. Those portions existed in dimensions where conventional matter couldn't interact. But where the beams struck solid matter, they carved burning wounds. The creature shrieked again, this time in pain. And then it attacked. Tentacles or appendages or whatever they were shot forward with impossible speed, wrapping around the Percival's hull. The Imperial ship's armor groaned under pressure that bent physics. Hull plates buckled. The crew's screams echoed across open comm channels. Defiant. We're moving to assist. The Hippocrates captain announced. Charging weapons. Artsay. Negative. Sisko countermanded. Target the distortion. Not the creature. If we collapse the rupture, it might return to wherever it came from. The Percival doesn't have that long. Commander. Sisko watched the tactical display. The Imperial ship was taking catastrophic damage, but firing on the creature had proven minimally effective. Meanwhile, the distortion continued expanding, feeding the creature's presence in their dimension. All ships. Concentrate fire on the distortion's edge here. Sisko transmitted coordinates. Focused particle beams. Maximum intensity. We're going to force it to collapse. For a critical moment, no one moved. Then the Hippocrates weapons came online, targeting exactly where Sisko had specified. The Defiance phasers joined in, and finally, struggling under the creature's assault, the Percival redirected its remaining functional batteries to fire at the distortion instead of their attacker. 3 ships' weapons converged on the same point in space-time. The distortion's edge destabilized, its expansion reversing. The creature sensed what was happening and released the Percival, trying to flee back through the rupture to its home dimension. But the collapse was accelerating, faster than the creature could move. The rupture contracted around it, severing several appendages that fell away into normal space and immediately began dissolving into subspace radiation. The creature's psychic scream reached a crescendo of terror and rage. Then the distortion collapsed completely, sealing with a flash of exotic particles. The creature was gone. The severed appendages dissipated into nothing. And 3 ships hung in space. Crew stunned. Sensors still recording the aftermath. Damage report. Sisko ordered. Defiant is fine, we stayed at range, Kira reported. The Hippocrates reports minor shield stress, but the Percival. On the view screen, the Imperial ship was a mess. Hull breaches across 3 decks, atmosphere venting, reactor output unstable, people were dying over there, and everyone knew it. Hippocrates, this is Defiant. Deploy emergency repair teams to the Percival immediately. Already on it, Commander, came the reply. And on sensors, Sisko could see the Alliance ship maneuvering close to its Imperial counterpart, extending docking tubes, sending damage control teams across the gap between vessels. Old enemies, saving each other's lives. Because in that moment, survival mattered more than ideology. The aftermath of the creature's attack rippled through both fleets like a subspace shockwave. The Percival limped back to Imperial formation under escort from the Hippocrates, whose Alliance crew had spent 6 hours stabilizing the Imperial ship's reactor and patching hull breaches. 17 Imperial crew members died before damage control could reach them. Another 43 were injured. Several critically, but they all would have died without Alliance intervention. Sisko watched from ops as both flagships repositioned, Yang's and Reinhard's command ships drawing closer together than they'd been since the initial displacement. Within an hour, he received simultaneous requests for an emergency conference. This time, the tone was different, less adversarial posturing. More genuine urgency. The conference room felt different too. When Yang and Reinhard entered with their respective staffs, there was no territorial positioning, no calculated delays to establish dominance. They took their seats with the exhausted efficiency of commanders who'd just witnessed something that redefined their understanding of the universe. Commander Sisko, Reinhard began without preamble, my science division has analyzed the sensor data from the distortion. They informed me that the creature we encountered was extradimensional in origin, existing partially in our space-time and partially in somewhere else. Is that assessment consistent with your findings? Dax nodded. Completely. The creature was native to subspace or some adjacent dimensional layer. It was attracted to the rupture's energy signature the way bioluminescent predators are attracted to light in deep oceans. The distortion acted as both a beacon and a feeding ground. Which means, Yang continued the logic, that any attempt to recreate the original rupture and open a passage home would immediately attract more of those things. Possibly many more. Given that the original displacement was orders of magnitude larger than this echo event. That's the working theory, Sisko confirmed. We'd need to develop some kind of dimensional shielding or energy dampening before we could safely open a stable passage. And we don't currently have that technology. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Reinhard's expression remained controlled. But Sisko noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the only indication of the emotional impact. Yang's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly, as if a weight he'd been carrying had just doubled. So we're trapped, the Imperial Admiral von Reinhard stated flatly. Not just displaced, but effectively imprisoned in this galaxy by predators that would tear apart any escape route we tried to create. Not necessarily imprisoned, Dax corrected gently. But certainly not going home anytime soon. It would take years of research to develop the necessary countermeasures, assuming it's even possible. Reinhard's fingers drummed on the table once that tell of internal calculations Sisko had noticed before. Then we need to discuss our long-term strategic position. 63 capital ships. Approximately 1 million personnel total between both fleets. Stranded in foreign territory with finite supplies and no industrial base. Commander Sisko, I need to understand the political realities we're facing. What are our options? It was the first time Reinhard had asked for Federation guidance rather than stated Imperial demands. Sisko recognized it as a significant shift. That depends on what you want, Sisko replied carefully. The Federation could offer several possibilities. Asylum status for your personnel, resettlement on frontier worlds where your skills would be valuable, integration into Starfleet for those who qualify and want military careers, establishment of independent colonies in unclaimed space under Federation protection, or potentially, assistance in claiming uninhabited systems where you could rebuild your own societies. Become refugees, Yang said quietly. Scattered across your worlds. Absorbed into your culture, our civilizations dissolved into memory. Not necessarily, Kira interjected. The Federation has welcomed displaced peoples before. After the Cardassian occupation ended, thousands of Bajoran refugees returned from Federation space to rebuild. Their culture survived because we helped them preserve it. The same could be true for you. But at what cost? Reinhard's question carried genuine curiosity rather than accusation. Major Kira, your people maintained their identity through decades of occupation and displacement. But you were already unified by shared culture and history. We are not. The Empire and the Alliance represent fundamentally incompatible visions of human society. If we're not fighting each other, what holds either civilization together? It was an astute observation. And it cut to the heart of the problem. Yang leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. The Marshal raises a valid point. The Free Planets Alliance exists because it stands against the Empire. Our entire democratic identity is defined in opposition to Imperial autocracy. If we're no longer fighting that war, do we have any reason to maintain the Alliance structure? Or do we simply become refugees who happen to share a common origin? The same question applies to the Empire, Reinhard acknowledged. I've spent my career working to reform the Goldenbaum dynasty from within, eliminating corrupt nobles, modernizing our society, preparing for a future where the Empire could be something better than its decadent past. But that future assumed we'd win the war and have the authority to implement reforms. Here, I'm just another displaced officer with no empire to reform. Sisko watched the two admirals with growing interest. This was the first time they'd spoken to each other almost as colleagues rather than enemies. The shared crisis had created an opening for genuine dialogue. Perhaps, Sisko suggested carefully, the question isn't whether your civilizations can survive displacement, but whether this displacement offers an opportunity to become something neither of you could have been while locked in eternal war. A pretty sentiment. Commander, von Reinhard said skeptically. But civilizations don't transform themselves overnight. We have 150 years of hatred to overcome. Generations of soldiers who've lost family and friends to the enemy. You're asking us to simply forget all that? No, Kira said firmly. You never forget. I still remember every Cardassian who participated in the occupation, every atrocity, every friend I lost fighting them. But I learned that holding on to hatred only poisons your own future. Bajor had to choose between revenge and rebuilding. We chose rebuilding. And it was the hardest thing we'd ever done. Yang's intelligence officer, the sharp-eyed woman Sisko had noticed in previous meetings, spoke up for the first time. Commander, we've been monitoring your station's information networks. We've learned about the Dominion War. You mentioned the conflict that nearly destroyed your Alpha Quadrant. What happened to the losing side after that war ended? Dax fielded the question. The Dominion retreated to the Gamma Quadrant. The Cardassian Union, which had allied with the Dominion, was devastated, billions dead, their infrastructure destroyed. But the Federation didn't pursue revenge. We offered humanitarian aid, helped them rebuild. It's still ongoing, and tensions remain, but we chose reconciliation over annihilation. Even after they tried to destroy you? Reinhard's sister Anna-Rose asked. Her voice carrying genuine surprise. Especially after they tried to destroy us, Sisko replied. Because perpetuating the cycle of violence serves no one's interests. The Cardassians learned that continuing the war would mean their extinction. We learned that winning a war doesn't mean anything if you lose your principles in the process. The conference room fell silent as both delegations absorbed that philosophy. It was alien to everything they'd been raised to believe, the idea that mercy could be strategic, that compassion could be strength, that enemies could become something other than corpses or conquered subjects. Finally, Yang spoke, his voice carrying the weight of someone articulating a thought he'd been developing for years but never had the context to express. Commander Sisko, what if the Empire and the Alliance were to formally end our war? Not a ceasefire or an armistice, but an actual peace treaty, permanent cessation of hostilities, mutual recognition of sovereignty, collaborative rebuilding of what we've both lost. Could the Federation support such an agreement? Reinhard's head snapped toward Yang, his expression unreadable. You're proposing peace. After 150 years of conflict, you're suggesting we simply stop. I'm suggesting we recognize reality, Marshal, Yang replied evenly. We're both stranded in unknown space with no way home and finite resources. We can continue our war and guarantee mutual destruction, or we can end it and potentially survive. It's not idealism. It's pragmatism. Pragmatism dressed up as enlightenment, von Ruhenthal growled. The Empire doesn't surrender, and we certainly don't negotiate peace with rebels when what? Reinhard interrupted his advisor. His ice-blue eyes fixed on Yang. When we're sitting in our home galaxy with supply lines and reinforcements. We're not. Senior Admiral. We're here. Facing a choice between extinction and adaptation. He turned to Sisko. If we were to pursue Admiral Yang's proposal, what would the Federation require in exchange for support? Sisko felt the moment's gravity. Two civilizations built on war. Considering peace not because they'd found enlightenment but because survival demanded it. It wasn't the idealistic first contact scenario he'd hoped for, but it was real, and that made it more valuable than any philosophical conversion. The Federation would require three things, Sisko said. First, a verifiable cessation of hostilities, no attacks, no espionage, no proxy conflicts. Second, acceptance of Federation law and oversight while you're in our space. Third, good faith participation in a peace process that includes addressing historical grievances, war crimes, and the practical challenges of creating a lasting agreement. War crimes tribunals, Yang said quietly. Accountability for atrocities committed by both sides. That's what you're implying. It's not negotiable, Kira stated. If you want Federation support, you have to accept that justice matters. Not revenge, but accountability. Reinhard's jaw tightened. There are Imperial officers whose actions during the war were excessive. I've already been working to remove the worst offenders from power, but demanding public tribunals could destabilize what remains of Imperial military cohesion. And there are Alliance commanders who've committed their own atrocities, Yang acknowledged. Mass bombings of civilian targets, execution of prisoners, biological weapons deployment in desperate situations. Neither side is innocent. If we're going to do this, it has to be honest. The two admirals stared at each other across the table, and in that moment, Sisko saw something unprecedented, mutual recognition that their war had corrupted both sides and that ending it would require confronting uncomfortable truths. I need to consult with my advisors, Reinhard said finally. This isn't a decision I can make unilaterally, despite my rank. The Empire's officer corps would need to accept any peace agreement, or it would be worthless. Same for the Alliance. Yang agreed. Our government was democratic. I can propose peace. But ultimately the decision would require consensus from the fleet commanders and whatever political structure we can maintain. That's not going to be easy. Nothing worth doing is, Sisko said. But I'll tell you what I told the Dominion's founder when we negotiated their surrender. The alternative to peace is annihilation. Choose wisely. As the meeting adjourned, Sisko watched both delegations leave separately, their staffs already engaged in urgent discussions. Through the viewport, the two fleets hung in space, 63 warships carrying 1 million people whose lives would be defined by whatever decision their leaders made in the coming days. Dax moved to stand beside him. Do you think they'll actually do it? End a 150-year war just like that? I don't know, Sisko admitted. But they're considering it, and that's more than I expected 3 weeks ago. Sometimes survival does what idealism can't, forces people to make hard choices they'd never make otherwise. On his console, a message chimed. It was from Odo, reporting another incident on the promenade, this time. Imperial and Alliance officers drinking together at Quark's bar, sharing stories about the creature they'd all survived. Small moments of connection forming in the spaces between official policy. Maybe, Sisko thought, there was hope after all. The negotiations that followed were unlike anything Sisko had mediated before. Peace talks typically involve diplomats, lawyers, and politicians parsing language with surgical precision. These negotiations involved military officers who'd spent their entire careers perfecting the art of killing each other, now forced to sit in the same room and articulate why they should stop. It took 3 days just to agree on the framework. Yang wanted a democratic process with representatives from both fleets voting on key provisions. Reinhard insisted on hierarchical authority, with himself and Yang making binding decisions their subordinates would follow. They compromised on a hybrid approach: joint command decisions subject to ratification by senior officers from both sides, with the Federation acting as neutral arbiter and guarantor. Sisko found himself spending 18-hour days shuttling between delegations, interpreting not just language but centuries of cultural divergence. The Empire and the Alliance both spoke variations of the same human language, but words carried different weights. When Imperial officers talked about order, they meant strict social hierarchy enforced by aristocratic authority. When Alliance officers used the same word, they meant democratic institutions protecting individual liberty. The gap between their definitions could swallow worlds. By the 5th day, they'd managed to draft a preliminary agreement. It was imperfect, full of compromises that satisfied no one completely, but it existed. The document sat on Sisko's desk, transmitted to him simultaneously by Yang and Reinhard, awaiting Federation endorsement. Article 1. Complete and permanent cessation of hostilities between the Galactic Empire and the Free Planets Alliance. Effective immediately upon ratification. Sisko read aloud to his senior staff. Article 2. Mutual recognition of sovereignty and right to self-governance for all personnel and territories under respective command. Article 3. Establishment of joint tribunals to investigate war crimes and atrocities committed by either side, with proceedings overseen by Federation legal observers. Article 3 is going to be the problem, Kira predicted. Nobody wants their people held accountable for what they did during the war. Actually, Dax interjected, pulling up the negotiation transcripts. Yang insisted on including it. He specifically referenced Alliance commanders who authorized civilian bombings during the 8th Battle of Iserlohn. Said that if peace means anything, it has to start with acknowledging what was done in war's name. O'Brien whistled low. That takes conviction. Volunteering your own people for war crimes tribunals. Reinhard matched him, Sisko noted, scrolling through the Imperial response. He provided a list of 17 Imperial nobles who committed what he calls excessive acts inconsistent with military necessity. Execution of prisoners, orbital bombardment of undefended colonies, forced labor conscription. He's offering them up for prosecution. He's also purging his political enemies. Odo observed cynically. Nobles who opposed his reform agenda. This way he eliminates them while appearing principled. Maybe. Sisko allowed. But even cynical motivations can produce positive outcomes. If both sides are willing to prosecute their own war criminals, it creates a foundation for genuine accountability. Kira studied the document with the careful attention of someone who'd negotiated Bajor's post-occupation treaties with Cardassia. What about territorial claims? They're both stranded here with nowhere to go. Are they planning to establish separate colonies? Joint settlements? Integration into existing Federation worlds? That's Article 7, Sisko said, pulling up the relevant section. They're proposing something unusual: a joint colonial venture in an unclaimed system about 40 light-years from here. The Guevara system. 3 habitable planets, no indigenous sentient life, rich mineral resources. They want to establish a unified settlement where both populations can rebuild together. The concept hung in the air, radical in its implications. Not separate colonies preserving their distinct cultures, but a genuinely integrated society where former enemies would live, work, and build a future side by side. That's ambitious, Dax said carefully. Also potentially catastrophic if it fails. You'd have 1 million people crammed together on frontier worlds with 150 years of hatred to work through. One major incident could trigger civil war. Or it could force them to actually confront their differences instead of maintaining them across separate territories, Sisko countered. Proximity breeds either violence or understanding. We're betting on understanding. Are we betting Federation resources on it too? O'Brien asked. Because that treaty is going to require significant support colony infrastructure, medical facilities, educational systems, security enforcement until they can maintain their own. We're talking about billions of credits and years of commitment. Starfleet Command is aware. Sisko confirmed. I've been in communication with Admiral Ross. The Federation Council is treating this as a long-term stabilization project. If we can successfully transform two warring civilizations into a peaceful society, it validates everything the Federation stands for. It's worth the investment. Before anyone could respond, Sisko's console chimed with an urgent transmission. Odo's face appeared. His expression grim. Commander, you need to get to the promenade. Now. We have a situation. Sisko was moving before Odo finished speaking, Kira and Dax following close behind. They found the promenade in chaos, not the explosive violence of a riot, but the tense standoff that preceded one. Two groups faced each other across the main thoroughfare. Approximately 30 Imperial officers on one side, 40 Alliance personnel on the other. Odo's security teams formed a thin line between them, hands on phasers, ready to stun anyone who moved wrong. At the center of the confrontation stood two men. One wore Imperial uniform with senior captain's insignia, an older officer with the scarred face and cold eyes of someone who'd seen extensive combat. The other was Alliance. Younger but carrying himself with the dangerous confidence of a decorated veteran. Between them, on the promenade's deck, lay an unconscious Imperial lieutenant bleeding from a head wound. What happened? Sisko demanded, his voice cutting through the angry murmurs. Imperial Captain Fahrenheit claims his lieutenant was attacked without provocation, Odo reported, positioning himself between the two leaders. Alliance Major Lin says the Imperial officer made threatening statements about Alliance war crimes and threw the first punch. Both sides are demanding justice, which apparently means beating each other senseless. Sisko stepped forward, putting himself directly in the confrontation's line of fire. Captain Fahrenheit. Major Lin's. Stand down. Both of you. With respect. Commander. This is an internal matter. Fahrenheit said, his accent carrying the clipped precision of Imperial aristocracy. One of my officers was assaulted. Alliance discipline has always been lax, but I won't tolerate violence against Imperial personnel on neutral ground. Neutral ground? Major Linz laughed bitterly. Your lieutenant started spouting off about how Alliance pilots are cowards who hide behind our ships while Imperial forces fight with honor. He insulted men I served with, men who died fighting your empire. I told him to shut up. He took a swing. I responded, that's not assault, that's self-defense. Convenient narrative, Fahrenheit replied coldly. My lieutenant is unconscious with a fractured skull. You're uninjured. That suggests who the actual aggressor was. The two groups edged closer, the tension ratcheting up moment by moment. Sisko could feel the situation spiraling. All the progress of the past week threatening to collapse because two men couldn't control their tempers. Enough. Sisko said quietly, but with enough command presence to cut through the noise. Odo, take both officers into custody. The injured lieutenant goes to the infirmary under security escort. We'll review security footage and witness testimony, and then Federation justice will determine what happened. That's not negotiable. You have no authority over Imperial personnel, Fahrenheit objected. Actually, he does, a new voice interrupted. Reinhard von Lohengramm emerged from the crowd. His white and gold uniform immaculate as always. Captain Fahrenheit, you will comply with Commander Sisko's instructions. That's a direct order. On the other side, Yang Wen-li appeared, looking disheveled and exhausted but carrying undeniable authority. Major Linz, stand down. Let Federation security handle this. For a tense moment, nobody moved. Then, grudgingly, both officers allowed Odo's deputies to escort them away. The crowds began dispersing, though the angry muttering continued. The wounded Imperial lieutenant was carried to the infirmary, leaving a trail of blood on the promenade deck that someone would have to clean up, a visual reminder of how quickly diplomacy could bleed into violence. Sisko pulled both admirals aside, into a conference room off the main thoroughfare. We have a problem. You're trying to negotiate a permanent peace treaty while your people are ready to kill each other over insults in a bar. How do you expect this to work? Reinhard's expression was controlled fury, though Sisko wasn't sure if it was directed at his own officers, the situation, or himself. Captain Fahrenheit is a reactionary, one of the old guard who still believes in the Goldenbaum dynasty's aristocratic supremacy. I've been trying to sideline officers like him, but I can't simply purge everyone who disagrees with my reforms. That would trigger a military coup. And Major Linz lost his entire squadron at the Battle of Vermilion. Yang added quietly, 24 pilots under his command. All killed when Imperial forces deployed a new missile doctrine we hadn't anticipated. He's been carrying that survivor's guilt for 8 months. Hearing some Imperial officer disparage Alliance courage probably triggered something he couldn't control. Then control it, Kira said bluntly. Both of you. Because if you can't manage your own people, this peace treaty is worthless. You'll just be delaying the inevitable violence. Yang and Reinhard exchanged a look, not the hostile calculation of enemies, but something closer to shared understanding of an impossible task. What would you have us do, Major? Yang asked. Execute everyone who can't let go of the hatred? Court-martial veterans for having emotions about watching their friends die? We're asking 1 million people to fundamentally change everything they've believed about their enemy. That doesn't happen because we sign a document. No, Sisko agreed. It happens because leaders demonstrate a different path and enforce consequences for those who won't follow it. You want Federation support for your peace process? Then you need to show us you're serious about maintaining it, even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. Reinhard stood motionless for a long moment. His ice-blue eyes calculating probabilities and outcomes that only he could see. Then he nodded. Decision made. Captain Fahrenheit will be relieved of command and reassigned to non-combat duties. If he objects, he'll face court-martial for insubordination. I'll make it clear that officers who can't adapt to the new reality will be removed from positions of authority. Major Lins will undergo psychiatric evaluation and counseling, Yang said. If he's fit to continue serving, he'll be assigned to non-combat roles where contact with Imperial personnel is minimal. If he's not fit, he'll be honorably discharged with full benefits. I won't punish him for trauma, but I also won't let him jeopardize the peace. Fair enough, Sisko acknowledged. But this is just one incident. There will be more. Probably many more, as your people process what this peace means and what they're being asked to give up. Then we deal with them as they come, Yang replied. It's not perfect, Commander. Nothing about this situation is perfect. But it's the best option available, and we're committed to making it work. Through the conference room viewport, Deep Space Nine's promenade was returning to normal operations. Shops reopened, civilians resumed their business, and the blood on the deck was being cleaned away by station maintenance. But Sisko knew the stain would remain in everyone's memory, a reminder that peace was fragile. Built on the willingness of exhausted people to try something different even when every instinct told them to fight. The treaty ratification vote is scheduled for tomorrow, Reinhard said. I'll need to address my officer corps, explain why we're ending a war my predecessors spent a century and a half prosecuting. It won't be an easy speech. I'll be doing the same with Alliance personnel, Yang said. Convincing Democrats to trust an Imperial Marshal and convincing career soldiers that peace serves their interests better than victory. I'm not sure which will be harder. Both will be impossible, Sisko said honestly. But you'll do it anyway, because the alternative is watching everything you've built collapse into chaos. That's what command means, making the hard choices when there are no good options left. The two admirals left separately, each returning to their respective flagships to prepare for the most important speeches of their careers. Sisko remained in the conference room with Kira and Dax, watching the fleets through the viewport. Do you think they'll pull it off? Dax asked. I think they'll try, Sisko replied. And sometimes, that's all you can ask. The ratification vote took place simultaneously aboard both flagships, transmitted across all ships in both fleets and broadcast to Deep Space Nine. Sisko watched from ops as two very different leadership styles addressed their respective forces. Reinhard von Lohengramm stood on the bridge of his flagship Brunhild, framed by the Imperial Eagle emblem that had represented the Goldenbaum dynasty for 6 centuries. His white and gold uniform seemed to absorb the bridge's harsh lighting, making him appear almost ethereal. Behind him stood his senior admirals von Ruhenthal, Mittermeier, and others whose names had become legendary across their galaxy for tactical brilliance and ruthless efficiency. Officers and crew of the Imperial Space Armada, Reinhard began, his voice carrying the crystalline authority Sisko had come to recognize. 6 weeks ago, we were fighting the 8th Battle of the Izerlon Corridor. We expected to live or die in service to the Empire, continuing a war that began before our grandparents were born. Instead, we were torn from our galaxy and deposited here stranded in unknown space. Cut off from home. Forced to confront realities we never anticipated. On the split screen, Wen-li addressed Alliance personnel from the bridge of his flagship Hyperion. Unlike Reinhard's formal presentation, Yang stood casually, hands in his pockets, surrounded by officers who looked more like colleagues than subordinates. His green uniform was rumpled, and he held a cup of tea, rather than a ceremonial prop. I'm going to be honest with you, Yang said conversationally. I never wanted this command. I became an admiral because I was good at keeping people alive in impossible situations, not because I enjoyed the authority. And I certainly never imagined I'd be standing here recommending that we end a war that's defined our entire civilization. But here we are. And we need to talk about what happens next. Reinhard continued, some of you are wondering if this peace treaty represents surrender. It does not. The Empire has not been defeated, we were displaced. But we also cannot pretend that our circumstances haven't changed. The Federation we've encountered represents a political model we were taught to despise. Democracy. They call it. Rule by the masses. Governance. By consensus. The Golden Bomb dynasty would have viewed such a system as weakness. The thing about war, Yang said, is that it simplifies everything. There's the enemy. And there's us. Every decision, every sacrifice, every death has clear meaning because it serves the cause of defeating them. Peace is messier. It requires us to see our enemies as people with legitimate grievances, legitimate ideals, legitimate reasons for fighting. That's uncomfortable. It's supposed to be. Sisko watched both speeches with professional interest. Reinhard was making an intellectual argument, appealing to imperial pragmatism and strategic necessity. Yang was making an emotional one, acknowledging the discomfort while validating his people's feelings. Different approaches to the same goal. But I've observed this federation for 6 weeks, Reinhard said, his voice taking on an edge of conviction. And I've concluded that our ancestors were wrong. Democracy, when properly structured, when led by capable individuals, when constrained by law, rather than mob passion, is not weakness, it is a tool. And like any tool, its value depends on who wields it. The Federation has achieved something the Empire never could, genuine cooperation between multiple species, multiple cultures, multiple value systems. They've built a civilization that adapts and endures precisely because it embraces diversity rather than enforcing uniformity. I've been thinking about why we fight, Yang continued. The official answer is ideology. We're defending democracy against autocratic tyranny. But honestly, most of us fight because it's what we've always done. Because everyone we know has lost someone to the Empire, and stopping feels like betraying their memory. Because the war gives our lives structure and meaning and purpose. Without it, who are we? Kira leaned toward Sisko. He's going somewhere with this. Right? Because if his point is we don't know who we are without war, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement for peace. Wait, Sisko murmured, watching Yang's expression shift. Here's what I think, Yang said. I think we're people who've survived 150 years of conflict. I think we're capable of more than just fighting and dying. I think we have skills, knowledge, culture, history that deserves to exist for reasons beyond killing the enemy efficiently. And I think that if we can't figure out who we are without war, then we've wasted everything our ancestors fought for. Reinhard was building toward his conclusion. This treaty asks us to work alongside former enemies. To establish joint colonies where Imperial and Alliance citizens will live together. To submit to war crimes tribunals that will hold both sides accountable for atrocities. Some of you will find this unacceptable. I understand. But I am ordering you to accept it anyway. Because the Empire's survival depends on adaptation. Those who cannot adapt will be left behind. The treaty we're voting on isn't perfect. Yang acknowledged. It won't erase the past or bring back the people we've lost. It won't magically transform our enemies into friends. What it does is give us a chance, maybe the only chance we'll ever have, to build something better than what we left behind. A society that learns from both systems. That takes the Alliance's democratic ideals and the Empire's organizational efficiency and creates something new. Something worth surviving for. Both admirals paused, letting their words settle across hundreds of ships and 1 million listeners. The vote is simple, Reinhard stated. Ratify the treaty and accept Federation mediation of our peace process, or reject it and continue the war until mutual annihilation. I have cast my vote in favor of ratification. Senior officers, transmit your votes now. I'm voting yes, Yang said simply. I'm voting to end the war, to try peace, to give our people a future that isn't defined by violence. I'm asking you to trust me one more time. And if you can't trust me, trust the basic math. We can't win this war anymore, but we can survive it. That's worth something. The voting process took 20 minutes. Sisko watched the tally displays update in real time, transmitted simultaneously from both fleets. Imperial votes came through in hierarchical order, senior admirals first, then fleet commanders, then ship captains. Alliance votes were more chaotic, with officers casting ballots simultaneously in what Yang had described as aggressive democracy. The Imperial tally climbed steadily. 78% in favor. 15% opposed. 7% abstaining. High numbers. But Sisko noticed the abstentions clustered among certain ship classes, the older dreadnoughts crewed by aristocratic families. Vessels where traditional values ran deepest. The Alliance numbers were closer. 64% in favor. 28% opposed. 8% abstaining. More opposition. But Yang had warned this would happen. Democratic military forces men officers felt empowered to vote their conscience even against their commander's recommendation. Both sides have achieved majority ratification. Dax reported, running the final calculations. The treaty passes by the agreed-upon thresholds. It's official, the war is over. The moment felt simultaneously monumental and anticlimactic. No celebration, no dramatic ceremony. Just numbers on a display screen indicating that two civilizations had voted to stop killing each other. Sisko supposed that's what peace often looked like, not a triumphant conclusion but an exhausted agreement to try something different. Commander, I'm receiving a joint transmission from both flagships, Kira announced. They're requesting your presence for the formal signing ceremony. On my way, Sisko confirmed. He turned to Dax. You have ops. If anything develops while I'm gone, I'll handle it, she assured him. Go make history. The signing ceremony took place in Deep Space Nine's main conference room, which had been hastily reconfigured for the occasion. Federation flags flanked the central table alongside makeshift banners representing the Galactic Empire and Free Planets Alliance symbols hastily created because neither side had thought to bring ceremonial flags when they were accidentally displaced from their galaxy. Reinhard von Lohengramm arrived first, accompanied by his senior staff. He wore full Imperial regalia, medals and decorations that told the story of a meteoric military career. Yang Wen-li arrived moments later, his uniform slightly less rumpled than usual but still refusing to conform to military precision. The contrast between them remained stark, the aristocratic conqueror and the reluctant admiral, now preparing to sign their names to the same document. Sisko stood between them, holding the treaty text that had been negotiated over weeks of careful diplomacy. Admirals, before we proceed, I need to confirm that both of you understand the obligations this treaty imposes. You're not just ending hostilities. You're committing to a peace process that will require years of cooperation, compromise, and difficult conversations. The Federation will support you, but we can't make this work for you. That's your responsibility. Understood, Reinhard said formally. Acknowledged. Yang agreed. Sisko placed the treaty on the table, an actual physical document, because some moments required tangible symbols rather than digital abstractions. Reinhard signed first, his signature a sharp, precise script that reflected his personality. Yang signed second, his handwriting casual and efficient. Then Sisko signed as Federation witness and guarantor, making the agreement official under interstellar law. Congratulations, Sisko said quietly. You've just ended a 150-year war. The hard part starts now. Reinhard's lips quirked into something that might have been a smile. Commander Sisko, I've spent my entire career doing hard things. This is simply one more challenge to overcome. The difference, Yang observed, is that you can't overcome peace through tactical brilliance or strategic planning. Peace requires patience, humility, and the willingness to admit when you're wrong. Those aren't typically military virtues. Then we'll learn new virtues, Reinhard replied. Adaptation is survival. And we've proven we can survive. The ceremony concluded with formal statements transmitted to both fleets. No celebration, no jubilation, just the quiet acknowledgement that something significant had changed. Officers on both sides would process the implications in their own time, through their own cultural frameworks. But as Sisko watched both admirals leave the conference room walking separately but no longer as enemies, he felt cautiously optimistic. They'd taken the first step, everything else would be built on that foundation. One decision at a time. Kira found him later in his office, reviewing the implementation timeline for the Guevara system colonization project. It's really happening, she said. They're actually going to try living together. They are, Sisko confirmed. The first colonization wave launches in 3 weeks. 200,000 people mixed Imperial and Alliance. Carefully selected for skills and psychological compatibility. If it works, the rest follow. If it fails, then we'll have a civil war on a frontier world with 1 million refugees caught in the crossfire, Kira finished grimly. No pressure. No pressure, Sisko agreed. But he pulled up the colonization manifests anyway, studying the names and profiles of people who'd volunteered to build a new society from the ashes of an old war. Engineers and farmers. Teachers and doctors. Former soldiers looking for something to fight for besides each other. Maybe peace was possible after all. Not certain, not guaranteed, but possible. And sometimes, that was enough. The Guevara system hung in space like a promise waiting to be fulfilled or broken. 3 terrestrial worlds orbited a stable G-type star, Guevara Prime with its vast oceans and temperate continents, Guevara 2 with mineral-rich mountains and thin but breathable atmosphere, and Guevara 3, smaller and colder but possessing geothermal activity that could sustain underground settlements. Federation surveys had classified the system as ideal for colonization 15 years ago, but its distance from established shipping lanes had left it unclaimed. Now it would become home to two civilizations learning to live without war. Sisko stood on the bridge of the Defiant, leading a convoy of transport vessels carrying the first colonization wave. Behind them, Imperial and Alliance ships moved in careful formation, not battle groups but construction teams, agricultural specialists, medical personnel, and civilians who'd volunteered to build something new. 200,000 people betting their futures on the possibility of peace. Approaching Guevara Prime orbit, Dax announced from navigation. The planet looks even better than the survey data suggested. Extensive river systems, diverse biomes, no hostile megafauna. It's actually quite beautiful. On the view screen, the world resolved into stunning clarity: blue oceans, green continents, white polar caps, an unscarred world, untouched by war or industry, waiting for whatever humanity would make of it. All ships. This is Commander Sisko. Begin orbital insertion and prepare landing parties. Remember your assignments. Imperial and Alliance teams are working together on every site. No segregated settlements, no territorial claims. This is a joint colony or it's nothing. Acknowledgements came from dozens of ships. The convoy broke formation, transport vessels descending toward predetermined landing sites while construction ships remained in orbit to coordinate infrastructure deployment. Sisko had insisted on accompanying the first wave personally, despite Starfleet Command's concerns about risking a senior officer on what amounted to a social experiment. But this was too important to manage from Deep Space Nine. If the colonization failed, he needed to understand why and respond immediately. If it succeeded, he wanted to witness the moment when two warring peoples took their first steps toward shared existence. The Defiant descended through Guevara Prime's atmosphere, following an Imperial transport and an Alliance cargo hauler toward landing site Alpha, designated as the colony's capital district. The location had been chosen for strategic access to resources, a river delta providing fresh water, fertile plains for agriculture, and nearby mineral deposits for industrial development. As they broke through the cloud layer, Sisko saw the landing site transform from abstract coordinates to physical reality. Prefabricated structures were already being assembled by automated construction drones deployed hours earlier. Housing modules, medical facilities, power generation stations, communication arrays, the skeleton of a city taking shape and fast forward. But what struck Sisko most were the people. Imperial and Alliance personnel worked side by side, unloading supplies, positioning equipment, surveying terrain. An Imperial engineer consulted with an Alliance architect over foundation specifications. A mixed team of medical personnel set up a field hospital. Their color-coded uniforms, white and gold, green and gray, intermixing without apparent conflict. Children, the first generation who might grow up without war, ran between the work sites supervised by parents from both factions. It's actually happening, Kira breathed from tactical. They're doing it. It's been 3 hours. O'Brien cautioned. Give it time before we start celebrating. Old habits die hard. And these people have been enemies for 6 generations. The Defiant touched down on a prepared landing pad, and Sisko led his team out into Guevara Prime's atmosphere. The air was crisp and clean, carrying scents of alien vegetation that resembled but wasn't quite Earth's grasslands. Gravity registered at 0.97 standard. Barely noticeable. The sun hung at late afternoon angle, casting long shadows across the nascent colony. Wen-li met them at the landing pad, looking even more disheveled than usual with dirt on his uniform and exhaustion in his eyes. Commander Sisko, welcome to New Guevara. Or possibly Guevara City. We're still debating names. Democratic process is slower than I remembered, especially when you're trying to build consensus between people who've been trying to kill each other. I'll take slow consensus over fast dictatorship, came Reinhard's voice. The Imperial Marshal approached from the construction site, also showing signs of physical labor, his white uniform stained with dust, though he somehow still managed to carry himself with aristocratic dignity. Though I admit, Admiral Yang's point about efficiency has merit. We spent 2 hours this morning debating the optimal grid layout for residential districts, when any competent planner could have simply implemented a standard design. That standard design would have segregated Imperial and Alliance housing, Yang replied mildly. Which defeats the entire purpose of integrated settlement. So yes, we debated. That's how democracy works. I didn't object to the outcome, just the process, Reinhard clarified. Though I suppose I'm learning that process matters as much as results when you're building consensus rather than enforcing orders. Sisko watched the exchange with interest. 6 weeks ago, these two men had been preparing to annihilate each other. Now they were bickering like feuding architects over civic planning. It was progress, even if it didn't look particularly inspiring. "Show me the colony," Sisko requested. They walked through the growing settlement, Yang and Reinhard providing running commentary on construction progress and logistical challenges. The housing districts were taking shape, modular units that could be customized but maintained standardized layouts to prevent class stratification. The medical complex combined Federation technology with expertise from both Imperial and Alliance physicians. The education center would teach children from both cultures, with curriculum committees still negotiating exactly what that would mean. But it was the small details that revealed the deeper transformation. An Imperial family sharing a meal with Alliance neighbors. Children playing together without awareness of historical enmity. A memorial garden under construction, honoring dead from both sides, names carved in stone, grievances acknowledged but not perpetuated. A marketplace where merchants from both factions traded skills and goods, establishing economic interdependence. "We've had incidents," Yang admitted as they walked. "Arguments. Fights. One attempted assault that we contained quickly. Some people can't let go of the hatred. We've established counseling services, conflict resolution protocols, and as a last resort, relocation to single-faction settlements for those who absolutely cannot adapt." "How many relocations?" Kira asked. 237 so far, Reinhard answered. "Out of 200,000 colonists. A 0.12% failure rate. Lower than I predicted. Higher than I hoped," Yang countered. "But manageable." They reached the colony's administrative center, a large prefabricated structure serving as temporary government headquarters. Inside, a joint council met in session, representatives from both factions debating resource allocation for the next construction phase. The arguments were heated but procedural. Conflicts resolved through voting rather than violence. "We've established a hybrid governance model," Yang explained. "Democratic elections for most positions, but with guaranteed representation for both cultural groups to prevent majority tyranny. It's messy and complicated and probably inefficient by Imperial standards, but it's working. It requires constant negotiation," Reinhard added. "Everything is a compromise, nothing is simple. But I'm beginning to understand why your Federation embraces this complexity, Commander. Diverse perspectives produce better solutions, even when the process is frustrating." Sisko was about to respond when alarms blared across the colony. His comm badge chirped urgently, Dax's voice cutting through with controlled alarm. "Commander, we've got incoming ships. Multiple vessels entering the Gavara system at high velocity. They're not broadcasting identification codes, and their weapon signatures are active." Sisko's stomach dropped. "How many ships?" 7 capital vessels, Imperial design but not matching any ships from our displaced fleets. "Benjamin, they're transmitting demands. They claim sovereignty over this system by right of conquest and are ordering all Alliance forces to surrender immediately or face annihilation." Reinhard's face went pale. "That's impossible. All Imperial ships came through the displacement together. There are no other Imperial forces in this galaxy. Unless," Yang said quietly, his tactical mind already processing implications. "The original rupture wasn't a unique event. Unless other ships have been displaced at different times and locations, scattered across Federation space, finding each other and regrouping." On every screen across the colony, the same image appeared, a transmission from the incoming fleet. A man in Imperial uniform appeared, older than Reinhard, his face bearing the hard lines of aristocratic cruelty. Behind him, officers wore decorations Sisko recognized from Imperial insignia, the noble houses that Reinhard had been working to marginalize, the reactionary faction that opposed his reforms. "This is Duke Braunschweig of the Galactic Empire," the transmission declared. "I claim this system and all persons within it under Imperial authority. Marshal von Lohengramm, you are charged with treason for negotiating peace with rebel forces. You will surrender yourself immediately, or I will reduce your pathetic settlement to ashes and establish proper Imperial order." The transmission cut. 7 warships hung in orbital space above Gavara Prime, weapons charged, targeting solutions locked on the defenseless colony below. The war they'd just ended was about to begin again, and this time, 200,000 civilians were caught in the crossfire. Reinhard stared at the screen, his ice blue eyes calculating odds and outcomes. "Braunschweig. I should have known. He commanded a fleet in the 6th sector, nowhere near Iserlohn when the displacement occurred. But if he was pulled through a separate rupture, weeks or months after us, then he doesn't know about the treaty," Yang finished. "He thinks this is still the war we left behind. And he sees your peace agreement as betrayal rather than adaptation." "Can we evacuate?" Kira asked, already knowing the answer. 200,000 people? O'Brien shook his head. "We'd need days and dozens of transport ships. We have maybe an hour before Braunschweig loses patience." Sisko's mind raced through scenarios, each one worse than the last. 7 Imperial warships against an undefended colony. The Defiant could engage, but 1 Federation ship versus 7 capital vessels was suicide. They could try diplomacy, but Braunschweig's transmission suggested he wasn't interested in negotiation. "We fight," Reinhard stated flatly. "I have 16 ships in orbit, construction vessels, transports, minimal weaponry. Against Braunschweig's battle group, will last maybe 20 minutes. But we buy time for evacuation. And we make it clear that the empire I represent rejects his authority. Alliance ships will fight alongside you." Yang added. 22 vessels. Similarly underarmed. "But we're not abandoning these people. Whatever time we can buy is time for civilians to reach shelter." "You're both planning to die," Kira observed. "Heroic. But strategically pointless if it just means everyone dies slower." Sisko looked at the orbital display showing Braunschweig's fleet positioning for bombardment. Then he looked at Yang and Reinhard, 2 former enemies now planning to die together, defending people from both their civilizations. The colony they'd built represented something neither had achieved in 150 years of warfare, proof that peace was possible. And he wasn't going to let it burn because one aristocratic reactionary couldn't accept that the war had ended. "We're not fighting," Sisko decided. "We're negotiating. But not with Braunschweig." He tapped his comm badge. Sisko to Defiant. "Contact Deep Space 9. I need an emergency channel to Starfleet Command. Priority Alpha. And get me every Federation ship within 3 sectors. I don't care what they're doing, tell them we have a colony full of civilians about to be massacred and we need immediate military support." "Benjamin, the nearest Starfleet vessels are 6 hours away minimum," Dax's voice replied. "We don't have 6 hours. Thanks for watching." "Then we stall," Sisko said grimly. "And we pray that 6 hours is enough." He turned to Reinhard and Yang. "Get your ships into defensive positions. Don't fire unless fired upon, but make it clear you're protecting this colony. I'm going to talk to Duke Braunschweig and convince him that attacking this colony is the worst mistake he could possibly make. He's an Imperial noble who believes in aristocratic supremacy and military conquest," Reinhard warned. "Diplomacy isn't going to work." "Maybe not," Sisko acknowledged. "But I'm going to try anyway. Because the alternative is watching 200,000 people die, and I'm not ready to accept that outcome." Above the colony, 7 warships waited. And somewhere beyond the orbital horizon, Federation reinforcements raced toward a confrontation that would determine whether peace could survive when war came calling. The confrontation played out across subspace channels and orbital trajectories, a deadly chess game where every move could trigger catastrophe. Sisko stood in the Defiance bridge, flanked by Reinhard and Yang, who'd beamed aboard to coordinate the defense. On the view screen, Duke Braunschweig's aristocratic contempt radiated like toxic waste. "You presume to lecture me on Imperial authority, Commander Sisko?" Braunschweig's voice dripped with disdain. "You're a minor functionary from a backwater station. The Galactic Empire has conquered star systems for 6 centuries. What makes you think your Federation has any relevance to our internal affairs?" "The fact that you're in Federation space threatening Federation-protected civilians," Sisko replied evenly. "You're not in your galaxy anymore, Duke. The rules have changed." "Rules?" Braunschweig laughed a harsh, ugly sound. "The only rule that matters is power, and I have 7 battleships to your, what? 1 escort vessel and a handful of construction transports? I could reduce that colony to radioactive ash before your reinforcements arrive. Don't insult me with threats you can't enforce." Sisko glanced at Dax's tactical display. The nearest Starfleet vessels, 3 cruisers and a Galaxy-class starship, were still 5 hours out, pushing maximum warp. Braunschweig was right. They didn't have the immediate firepower to stop him. But they had something else. "Reinhard," Sisko said quietly, "tell him what he's really up against." Reinhard von Lohengramm stepped forward, his presence commanding even through a view screen. "Duke Braunschweig, I am Imperial Marshal Reinhard von Lohengramm, Supreme Commander of the Space Armada. By authority granted through merit and battlefield success, I order you to stand down immediately." Braunschweig's expression twisted into something between amusement and rage. "You dare claim authority over me? You're a commoner playing at nobility, Reinhard. Your reforms threaten the very foundation of Imperial society, and now you've betrayed the Empire entirely by negotiating with rebel scum." He gestured dismissively. "Your authority means nothing here. I represent true Imperial values, the aristocratic order that made our civilization great." "You represent a dying system," Reinhard countered coldly. "The Goldenbaum dynasty's corrupt nobles, genetic purity laws, and feudal oppression. I've spent years working to reform those failures. Now you've been handed an opportunity to build something better. And you're choosing to perpetuate the same mistakes that kept us locked in a century and a half of pointless war." Pointless? Braunschweig's face flushed with anger. The war is about imperial supremacy over democratic chaos. It's about maintaining proper social order against the mob's demands for equality. You may have forgotten those principles, but I have not. Yang Wen-li spoke up, his voice carrying the tired patience of someone who'd had this argument countless times. Duke Braunschweig. I'm Admiral Yang Wen-li of the Free Planets Alliance. I've studied your military record. You're a competent commander who's won significant victories through superior tactics and logistics. You're not stupid. So I'm asking you to think clearly about what you're proposing. I don't negotiate with rebels, Braunschweig spat. Then just listen, Yang continued. You have 7 ships. Marshal von Lohengramm commands 56 ships in this system and nearby space. I command 29. That's 85 capital vessels total. Even if you destroyed this colony, which would take at least 30 minutes of sustained bombardment, you'd be annihilated by our combined forces within the hour. You can't win this engagement. Combined forces? Braunschweig's eyes narrowed. You're admitting that Imperial and Alliance ships would fight together? Against other Imperial vessels? That's treason of the highest order. No, Reinhard said quietly. That's the new reality. The war is over, Duke. We signed a peace treaty 6 weeks ago, ratified by senior officers from both fleets. We're establishing joint colonies, prosecuting war criminals from both sides, building a society that doesn't require generational slaughter to maintain itself. You can join that process. Or you can be destroyed defending principles that have already been abandoned by the people you claim to lead. The transmission fell silent. Sisko watched Braunschweig's expression cycle through disbelief, fury, and something that might have been fear. The Duke wasn't stupid. Yang was right about that. He could see the tactical situation clearly. 7 ships versus 85 was suicide, regardless of ideological conviction. But pride and ideology could make people choose death over adaptation. Sisko had seen it before: the Cardassian officers who'd fought to the last rather than accept the Dominion War's outcome, the Maquis colonists who'd died defending their settlements from overwhelming force. Sometimes, people couldn't let go of who they'd been long enough to become who they needed to be. You want me to surrender? Braunschweig said finally. To accept this peace treaty with rebel forces. To integrate my crews into your new society and pretend that a century and a half of warfare can be forgiven with signatures on a document. No, Sisko interjected. We want you to recognize that you have a choice. You can die here, accomplishing nothing except the murder of civilians who've already chosen a different path. Or you can live, maintain command of your ships and crews, and participate in building something that might actually be worth surviving for. The Federation offers asylum, Dax added from her station. Your personnel would have the same rights and opportunities as any displaced persons under our protection. We're not asking you to abandon your culture or identity. We're asking you to stop fighting a war that's already over. Braunschweig's jaw tightened. Behind him, his bridge officers waited tensely, hands hovering near weapon controls. One word from their Duke, and this negotiation would end in fire and death. My crews, Braunschweig said slowly, are loyal to the Empire. To the principles I described: order, hierarchy, strength. If I accept your treaty, many of them will view it as betrayal. Some may refuse orders. Then you'll need to lead them, Reinhard replied. Explain the situation. Demonstrate why adaptation serves their interests better than destruction. That's what leadership means: not just commanding in battle, but guiding people through transitions they don't want to make. Kira leaned toward Sisko, whispering urgently. Commander, the Starfleet reinforcements have dropped to 4 hours. But Braunschweig's ships are shifting into bombardment formation. If he's going to fire, it'll be in the next few minutes. Sisko nodded acknowledgement but kept his focus on the view screen. Everything hinged on whether one aristocratic officer could accept that the universe had changed and he needed to change with it. I have conditions, Braunschweig stated finally. Let's hear them, Sisko replied, feeling a cautious flicker of hope. First, I maintain independent command of my fleet. I won't subordinate my forces to von Lohengramm's authority or Alliance oversight. Second, my crews are not subject to your war crimes tribunals. We fought honorably, according to Imperial military law. Third, we receive equal representation in any colonial governance structures. Reinhard's expression hardened. Your first condition is acceptable with modifications: independent tactical command but strategic coordination with joint forces. Your second condition is negotiable depending on specific actions taken by your personnel. Your third condition is already guaranteed by the treaty framework. The War Crimes Tribunal issue is non-negotiable from the Federation's perspective, Sisko added firmly. If your personnel committed atrocities, they'll be investigated and potentially prosecuted. That's the price of Federation protection. But investigations will be fair, evidence-based, and conducted with full legal representation. Braunschweig was silent for a long moment, his aristocratic features struggling to mask the internal conflict. Then he looked directly at Reinhard. You really believe this can work? That centuries of imperial culture can coexist with democratic rabble? That peace is possible between civilizations that have been killing each other since our great-grandparents were children? I don't know, Reinhard admitted honestly. But I know that continuing the war guarantees mutual destruction. And I know that the Federation has achieved something we never could: genuine cooperation between diverse peoples. If they can do it, maybe we can too. It's worth trying. Yang added his perspective. Duke Braunschweig. I've spent 11 years fighting this war. I've lost friends, family, and most of my idealism about what we were fighting for. The alliance became as corrupt and cynical as the empire we opposed. But this colony, this ridiculous, optimistic attempt to make former enemies into neighbors, it's the first thing in a decade that's made me think maybe the war didn't have to be permanent. Maybe we could be something other than killers. Don't destroy that because you're afraid of change. The orbital display showed Braunschweig's ship's holding position, weapons charged but not firing. 200,000 people on the ground waited in shelters, hoping that words would prove stronger than particle beams and nuclear warheads. Finally, Duke Braunschweig exhaled slowly, a sound of resignation, acceptance, and perhaps relief. Very well. I accept the treaty terms. With the conditions we've discussed. My fleet will stand down and coordinate with joint forces. But understand this, von Lohengramm. I'm doing this because tactical reality demands it. Not because I've abandoned imperial principles. The day may come when those principles conflict with your new order, and on that day, we'll have a different conversation. Fair enough, Reinhard acknowledged. I'm not asking you to abandon who you are. Just to recognize that who you are can exist without requiring everyone else to die or submit. The tension on the Defiance bridge released like a held breath. Sisko watched the tactical display as Braunschweig's ships powered down their weapons and adjusted to holding orbits. No bombardment. No massacre. Just a reluctant aristocrat accepting that the universe had changed and he couldn't change it back. All ships, stand down from combat alert. Sisko ordered. Duke Braunschweig, you and your senior staff are invited to Deep Space Nine for formal treaty signing and integration briefings. Admiral Yang and Marshal von Lohengramm will coordinate the details. As the transmission ended, Kira slumped in her chair with visible relief. That was too close. If he'd been just a bit more fanatical, or a bit less intelligent. But he wasn't, O'Brien said. Sometimes people surprise you. Not often, but sometimes. Dax pulled up the updated fleet rosters, now showing 92 Imperial and Alliance vessels integrated into a loose coalition under Federation oversight. Benjamin, with Braunschweig's forces added, we're looking at nearly 1.2 million displaced persons from their galaxy. The colonization projections will need to be revised. We'll need additional systems beyond Guevara. More Federation support. Expanded infrastructure. We'll manage, Sisko said. We brought two warring civilizations to peace. Logistics are just logistics. Reinhard and Yang stood together near the view screen, watching the orbital display where their combined fleets now held station peacefully. Former enemies, now reluctant allies, bound together by displacement and necessity and the fragile hope that peace might actually be possible. This isn't how I expected my career to end. Yang mused. Not commanding forces, but building colonies. Not fighting battles, but negotiating housing allocations and agricultural policy. It's deeply unglamorous. But necessary, Reinhard replied. And perhaps more meaningful than anything we accomplished during the war. Killing is easy, Admiral. Creation is hard. They were interrupted by transmissions from the colony below. Celebration, relief, gratitude from 200,000 people who'd been hours away from annihilation. Children who would grow up in peace, families who could build futures without fear of bombardment, former soldiers who could learn trades that didn't involve weaponry. Sisko watched it all from the Defiance bridge and felt something he hadn't felt since the Dominion War ended. Genuine hope. Not the naive optimism of someone who'd never seen war, but the hard-earned hope of someone who knew how rare peace was and how much effort it required to maintain. The Guevara colony would face challenges: cultural conflicts, resource disputes, political tensions between democratic and autocratic factions. Some people would never accept the peace, would cling to hatred until it consumed them. But others would try. They'd build homes, raise families, create art and culture and meaning that didn't depend on killing their neighbors. That was enough. That was everything. Set course for Deep Space Nine, Sisko ordered. We have a treaty to expand and about 1 million displaced persons to integrate into Federation space. It's going to be a long year. And after that? Kira asked. After that, we see if peace holds. One day at a time, one decision at a time, until maybe just maybe it becomes permanent. The Defiant broke orbit, leaving the colony to its fragile new beginning. Behind them, 92 warships maintained peaceful formation, their weapons silent, their crews learning to exist without war defining their purpose. Ahead, Deep Space Nine waited, ready to serve as the gateway between old conflicts and new possibilities. The war that had lasted 150 years was finally, genuinely over. What would be built in its place remained to be seen, but for the first time in 6 generations, the people of 2 warring civilizations could look toward the future without expecting to die defending it, and that was worth everything they'd sacrificed to achieve it. The Guevara colony celebrated its first anniversary with ceremonies that would have been unthinkable a year earlier. Imperial and Alliance families gathered in the central plaza, now officially named Reconciliation Square, to commemorate not a military victory but survival, adaptation, and the slow, painful process of building peace from the ashes of generational war. Sisko attended the celebration, along with Kira, Dax, and O'Brien. They stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as children from both cultures performed a musical program that blended Imperial martial anthems with Alliance folk songs into something entirely new. The result was occasionally discordant, sometimes beautiful, and always authentic, much like the colony itself. Wen-li had accepted the position of colonial administrator, a role he'd accepted with characteristic reluctance but performed with quiet competence. He stood on the platform, disheveled as ever, preparing to deliver the anniversary address. Beside him, Reinhard von Lohengramm served as Chief of Colonial Defense, a compromise title that acknowledged his military expertise while subordinating it to civilian governance. The dynamic between them remained complex, occasionally antagonistic, but fundamentally collaborative. A year ago, Yang began. His voice amplified across the plaza. We were enemies, not just military opponents, but ideological adversaries who believed our differences could only be resolved through the other side's destruction. The Galactic Empire represented order through hierarchy. The Free Planets Alliance stood for freedom through democracy. We spent 150 years trying to prove our system superior by annihilating theirs. He paused, letting the words settle across a crowd that included veterans from countless battles, civilians who'd survived occupation and bombardment, children born into war who'd never known peace. We were wrong, Yang continued simply. Not about our values, those remain legitimate and worth preserving, but about the assumption that different values couldn't coexist. The Federation showed us something we'd never imagined possible. A civilization where Vulcan logic and human emotion, Klingon honor and Ferengi commerce, Bajoran spirituality and dozens of other perspectives all contribute to a functioning society. They prove that diversity isn't weakness. It's strength. If you're willing to do the work. Reinhard stepped forward, his white and gold uniform replaced by civilian colonial attire that somehow still carried Imperial dignity. The work is difficult, he acknowledged. We've had failures. 2,300 colonists requested relocation to single-culture settlements because they couldn't adapt to integrated living. We've prosecuted 47 cases of assault and hate crimes. We've had political gridlock, economic disputes, and more arguments about residential zoning than any civilization should endure. A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, the shared recognition of bureaucratic frustrations that transcended cultural boundaries. But we've also had successes, Reinhard continued. 4,000 mixed-culture marriages. The first generation of children born as citizens of neither the Empire nor the Alliance, but of Guevara. Schools where Imperial efficiency combines with Alliance innovation to produce educational outcomes exceeding either system's historical standards. An economy built on cooperation rather than conquest. The crowd erupted in applause, genuine, enthusiastic, marking progress that a year ago would have seemed impossible. Sisko watched it all with the satisfaction of someone who'd taken an enormous risk and seen it pay off. The Guevara colony wasn't perfect. The expanded colonization across 4 additional systems faced ongoing challenges. Duke Braunschweig's faction maintained an uneasy relationship with the joint government, neither fully integrated nor openly rebellious. War crimes tribunals continued their slow, painful work of accountability and justice. But it was working. Against all probability. Against the weight of historical hatred. Against the cynical prediction that generational war couldn't end without one side's extinction, it was working. Commander Sisko, a familiar voice interrupted his thoughts. He turned to find a young woman, perhaps 20 years old, wearing civilian clothes that mixed Imperial and Alliance design elements. I wanted to thank you. My father served in the Alliance Navy. My mother was an Imperial logistics officer. They met during the resettlement process, fell in love, and now they run a hydroponics facility together. I was born 6 months ago, right here in Guevara City. I'm the first generation who'll never know the war except as history. She paused, emotion flickering across her features. My parents tell me stories about the battles they fought, the friends they lost, the years they spent hating each other's civilizations. And then they tell me about the choice they made to try something different. They say the Federation gave them that choice. And you personally made it possible. So thank you. For believing peace was possible when no one else did. Sisko accepted her gratitude with a nod, too moved to speak immediately. This was why Starfleet existed, not for military victories or territorial expansion, but for moments like this. For giving people the chance to become something better than their history had prepared them to be. Dax appeared at his side. Her expression knowing. Feeling philosophical, Benjamin? Just thinking about what we've accomplished. Sisko replied. 2 civilizations that spent 150 years trying to destroy each other. Now building a future together. It's not perfect, but it's real. The Federation Council is pleased. Dax reported. They're citing Guevara as proof that the Prime Directive's principles can be adapted for inter-universal refugees. There's talk of establishing similar programs for other displaced peoples, assuming we ever encounter more dimensional breaches. Let's hope we don't, Kira interjected. One massive colonization project is enough for a lifetime. O'Brien pointed toward the plaza. Where the musical program had concluded and dancing had begun, Imperial waltzes mixing with Alliance folk dances, creating hybrid forms that belong to neither culture exclusively but to both. You know what amazes me? They're making it look easy now. A year ago, these people were shooting at each other. Today they're dancing together and arguing about tax policy like any normal civilization. It's not easy, Sisko corrected gently. They just make it look that way because they've decided survival is worth the effort. That's all peace ever is, people choosing cooperation over conflict. One decision at a time. Until eventually it becomes habit instead of exception. As the celebration continued, Sisko's combadge chirped. A transmission from Deep Space Nine, Admiral Ross calling from Starfleet Command with new orders, new crises, new impossible situations that would require diplomacy, patience, and the stubborn belief that even the most intractable conflicts could be resolved without violence. But for now, he allowed himself this moment. 2 warring civilizations learning to live in peace, children who would grow up knowing cooperation instead of conflict. A colony built on the revolutionary idea that former enemies could become something more than adversaries. They could become neighbors, colleagues, friends, family. The war that had defined the Galactic Empire and Free Planet's alliance for 6 generations was truly over. What rose in its place was messy, imperfect, and occasionally frustrating, which was to say, it was alive and growing and real. Reinhard and Yang descended from the platform, pausing to shake Sisko's hand before rejoining their respective communities. 2 admirals who'd become administrators. Warriors who'd become builders. Enemies who'd become allies because circumstances had forced them to recognize that their shared humanity mattered more than their ideological differences. Live long and prosper, Sisko said quietly, the Vulcan blessing feeling appropriate for a moment that celebrated diversity, adaptation, and the possibility of peace. They would. All of them would. Not because peace was easy or natural or guaranteed, but because they'd chosen it. Chosen it over hatred, over revenge, over the comfortable certainty of eternal conflict. Chosen it despite the cost. Despite the difficulty. Despite every historical precedent suggesting it was impossible. And in choosing peace, they'd proven that even the longest wars could end not with victory or defeat, but with the simple recognition that survival required something better than the endless repetition of violence. The Guevara colony would face challenges ahead. So would the Federation. But today, under an alien sun on a world that belonged to neither the Empire nor the Alliance but to both, peace was possible, and that possibility was enough to build a future on.